The story begins not with the crack of gunfire, nor the thunder of bombs dropped from the pale skies, but with silence, the kind of silence that hangs over ruined streets long after the chaos has passed. Before we journey deeper, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tap the notification bell for more updates. In that silence, dust drifts like a heavy shroud, covering what remains of broken homes, crumbled walls, and abandoned possessions. This silence is not empty. It is full, echoing with the shadows of voices that once filled those spaces, children laughing, merchants calling out, the rhythmic murmur of evening prayers, the clatter of plates and cutlery in kitchens. A city lives even in its quiet, and when war comes, that silence begins to breathe differently. It carries grief. It carries memory. Syria, before its unraveling, was a tapestry of cultures, traditions, and histories that spanned millennia. Ancient stone, worn smooth by centuries of hands, marked the entryways of markets in Aleppo. Damascus, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, carried in its streets the faint footprints of Romans, Ottomans, Persians, Arabs, empires that came and went, each leaving their trace on the bones of the city. And then there was Palmyra, its desert ruins glowing amber under the sun, reminding those who wandered through its columns that civilizations rise, fall, and vanish into dust. The Syrian land was a vessel of time itself, holding within it the weight of countless generations. Yet within that ancient cradle, a modern story began to take shape, one that would test not just the endurance of a nation, but the moral fabric of the world that watched. What unfolded in Syria was not merely a civil war. It was a slow, harrowing unraveling of humanity, an endless parade of suffering that often remained hidden, obscured beneath the statistics, the headlines, and the geopolitical analyses that reduced living, breathing people into numbers, pawns, or collateral damage. The hidden human tragedy of Syria is not the clash of armies or the shifting borders of power. It is the mother who clutches her child in the darkness, listening for the whistle of bombs. It is the father who waits in line for bread that may never come. It is the boy who learns too early how to distinguish the sound of mortars from the buzz of drones, the girl whose lullabies are interrupted by the rumble of tanks. These stories exist on the margins of grand narratives, and yet they form the true marrow of this conflict. The Syrian Civil War began in 2011, in the wake of the Arab Spring. Across the Middle East and North Africa, protests surged against governments long accused of corruption, repression, and brutality. In Tunisia, a fruit vendor's self-immolation ignited a revolution. In Egypt, throngs filled Tahrir Square, demanding the resignation of Hosni Mubarak. In Libya, rebels took up arms against Muammar Gaddafi, with NATO's shadow looming overhead. And in Syria, a quiet anger stirred. It began in whispers, in demonstrations that carried the fragile hope of change. People believed they, too, might have a chance to reshape their future. But Syria was different. What started as protest became suppression. What began as peaceful marches became violent crackdowns. And what might have ended with reform transformed into the kind of conflict that swallows generations whole. Within months, the Syrian government met demonstrations with bullets, mass arrests, and intimidation. Then came tanks rolling into restless cities. Then artillery shells falling on neighborhoods. Then bombs raining down on markets. The spiral had begun, and with it, the world's gaze fell, briefly, before shifting away to other crises. The war dragged in neighbors and strangers alike. Foreign fighters arrived, drawn by ideology or opportunity. Regional powers funneled weapons, each hoping to tip the balance in their favor. Superpowers intervened, not for the sake of the people, but to secure influence over a land carved by history into a crossroads of civilizations. And all the while, civilians suffered in silence. Families were forced from their homes, driven into refugee camps across Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and far beyond, their lives suspended in tents and makeshift shelters. Others remained, trapped in cities under siege, where food became scarce, water unsafe, and medicine more precious than gold. To look at Syria is to look at the collapse of the ordinary. A classroom turned into rubble. A hospital transformed into a battlefield target. A playground covered in ash. The hidden human tragedy is not in the numbers, though they are staggering, millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead, but in the loss of ordinary moments that once defined life. The coffee shared in morning cafes. The evening strolls through bazaars. The prayers whispered at dawn. The familiar comfort of neighbors' voices. All swept away, leaving behind a hollow where daily life used to stand. For many in the world, Syria became a headline that repeated so often it blurred into noise. Bombing in Aleppo. Refugee crisis escalates. Chemical weapons attack. Words that scrolled across screens, consumed in seconds, and forgotten by morning. Yet behind each headline was a story stretching into years, stories of mothers carrying their children across endless deserts, of fathers lost at sea trying to ferry their families to safety, of children buried in rubble, their names unrecorded. These stories are the ones the world overlooked. And so, this is not a history told in battles or strategies alone. This is a history whispered in shadows, carried by voices that tremble at night, remembered by those who had to leave everything behind. This is the Syrian Civil War as a human tragedy, hidden not because it lacked magnitude, but because the world, in its rush to move on, often chose not to look too closely. The prologue of Syria's tragedy lies in its silence. It is the quiet streets at dawn in Homs before the protests began, where shopkeepers raised their shutters as if it were any other day. It is the peaceful prayers in Dara before the crack of gunfire interrupted them. It is the fleeting moment when Syrians believed their voices might shape a better tomorrow, before those voices were silenced by fear, and later, by the roar of war machines. It is not designed to lull with reassurance, but to invite the listener into a kind of uneasy meditation, a walk through the ruins of a nation where shadows linger. You may find, as you listen, that the war in Syria is not as far away as it seems. For within the broken stones and scattered ashes lie reflections of our shared humanity. The tragedy of Syria is not just theirs, it is ours. It is the proof that suffering can be ignored, that human lives can be weighed against interests and found wanting, that silence can stretch long enough to hide the cries of millions. To meditate on Syria is to confront this silence, to let it speak again, softly, eerily, insistently. And in that whisper, the hidden human tragedy begins to unfold. The streets of Syria before the storm had their own rhythm, a cadence that echoed through narrow alleys and wide boulevards. In Damascus, the air carried the scent of jasmine blooming at dusk, mingling with the aromas of strong coffee and roasted nuts. In Aleppo, traders shouted prices across the spice markets, their voices rising above the hum of bargaining. Children ran between stalls, their laughter scattering pigeons into the hot air. In Homs, taxi drivers leaned out of their windows, waving at familiar faces, as if the city itself were one extended family. For centuries, Syria had been marked not just by its monuments, but by the simple continuities of daily life. And yet, beneath those rhythms, tension brewed like an undercurrent, invisible but undeniable. Families spoke in hushed tones at dinner tables, lowering their voices when the conversation veered toward politics. Fear was already a guest in Syrian homes, quiet but constant. It was an unspoken rule: one did not speak openly about the government, about the regime, about the long shadow cast by authority. The silence was protective. It kept people safe. But silence, like glass, is fragile. Once broken, the shards cut deeply. In 2011, when protests in Dara began, they were not intended to spark a civil war. They were meant to be a plea, a demand for dignity, a request for reforms that seemed, at first, modest. Children had scrawled graffiti on the walls, slogans of freedom borrowed from Tunisia and Egypt, playful in their defiance. But those childish strokes of paint carried with them the weight of an entire nation's frustrations. The regime's response was swift and merciless: arrests, beatings, humiliation. Parents who went to demand the release of their children were met with insults and brutality. And so the silence that had blanketed Syrian life for decades cracked, its fracture lines spreading from Dara to Homs, Aleppo, Damascus, and beyond. The world often remembers wars as eruptions of sudden violence, but in truth, they often begin with whispers. The Syrian conflict was no different. The whisper of voices rising in protest. The whisper of fear that answered them. The whisper of gunfire on the edges of demonstrations. Soon, whispers became roars. And then came the blood. For those living inside Syria, the early days of the conflict were marked by confusion. Who was fighting? What was happening in other towns? Rumors moved faster than facts, and yet everyone knew someone who had been arrested, someone who had disappeared, someone who had been beaten in the street for daring to raise their voice. Fear spread like smoke, choking the air. But beyond fear, there was also an undeniable sense of awakening. For the first time in decades, people were speaking truths they had buried deep inside themselves. In alleyways, men and women gathered to talk in hushed tones, their words trembling but urgent. In homes, children listened from corners, absorbing the weight of conversations that had previously been forbidden. Hope and terror walked side by side, like twin shadows cast by the same light. It is in these quiet beginnings that the hidden human tragedy first reveals itself. For war does not only destroy buildings and bodies. It destroys trust, continuity, and the delicate fabric of everyday life. In a single instant, what was once ordinary becomes dangerous. A child writing graffiti. A family attending a funeral. A protester raising a flag. Each gesture, once harmless, becomes charged with mortal risk. And as the boundaries of safety collapse, the world of ordinary Syrians tilts into uncertainty. One woman, later interviewed in exile, described those early days in her hometown. We used to go to the market every Friday morning. It was tradition, a ritual as old as my marriage. But suddenly, Fridays became days of fear. Fridays meant protests, and protests meant soldiers, and soldiers meant blood. I stopped going. I stayed home. But even in my home, I could hear it, the chanting, the gunfire, the sirens. My walls could not keep the war outside. Her story is one among millions, yet it holds the shape of a greater truth. War seeps into the smallest spaces. It enters kitchens, prayer rooms, classrooms. It stains family rituals and remakes them into memories that cannot be touched without pain. The hidden tragedy of Syria is carried in these transformations, where the simple act of walking to market or attending school becomes an act of defiance, an act of danger. The war was not yet civil in its earliest days. It was a struggle between authority and its people, between silence and voice. But as months turned into years, the lines blurred, factions multiplied, and the land fractured. Foreign powers stepped in, each carrying their own interests disguised as aid or intervention. And while the world debated strategies, red lines, and resolutions, Syrian civilians bore the cost. The hidden tragedy is not only in death, though death was everywhere. It is also in what lingers among the living. The mother who rocks her child to sleep to the sound of distant shelling, whispering lullabies not to soothe the child, but to drown out her own fear. The father who returns home with empty hands after hours in breadlines, his silence heavier than hunger. The child who sketches pictures of airplanes dropping bombs, because those are the only images burned into his mind. These are the fragments of lives that rarely appear in reports, but they are the essence of the conflict. In the West, newsrooms debated whether to call it a civil war, a revolution, or an insurgency. Politicians spoke of red lines and ceasefires. Analysts drew maps, colored arrows showing the shifting control of towns and provinces. But those maps did not show the grandmother clutching her prayer beads as bombs fell around her. They did not show the teenager learning how to hide under rubble. They did not show the thousands of families who gathered their belongings into bags and fled into the night, hoping only to survive until morning. Syria's war is a war of erasure. Erasure of cities, of traditions, of futures. It is the erasure of neighborhoods that once echoed with joy. Aleppo, once a thriving city, became synonymous with ruin, its ancient markets reduced to ashes, its historic citadel looming over rubble. Homs, once called the capital of the revolution, became a wasteland of broken concrete, entire districts swallowed by silence. Entire generations of memory were lost in the destruction of these spaces, as if the war had not only killed the living but sought to erase the very record of their existence. And yet, amid the ashes, voices remained. Some recorded their stories, whispering into cameras, sending videos across borders before power was cut. Others painted murals on walls, even as the walls crumbled. Children played soccer with makeshift balls in refugee camps, their laughter startling in its persistence. These moments of resilience did not erase the tragedy, but they resisted its finality. They whispered back against the silence, insisting on being heard. The hidden human tragedy of Syria lies in this paradox, in the simultaneous presence of despair and resilience, in the haunting coexistence of ruin and memory. It is not a single story, but millions. It is not a single silence, but layers upon layers of muted voices, some crushed, some whispering still. And to listen is to invite unease, for within these stories lies the reminder of how easily the familiar can unravel, how quickly the ordinary can collapse into the unspeakable. As the prologue continues, let the weight of this silence settle. The war has not yet fully revealed itself, and already the air trembles with the enormity of what is to come. To enter Syria's story is to walk slowly into a fog, where shadows take shape only when you draw near. The tragedy waits there, hidden, waiting to be seen. War creeps in quietly before it announces itself with thunder. In Syria, it began with the subtle shift of daily patterns. A man who once lingered at the coffee house after prayers began hurrying home instead. Women who once walked freely to the markets began moving in groups, eyes lowered, steps quickened. Streets once bustling with vendors fell strangely empty in the afternoons, as if the air itself warned people to stay indoors. And in the stillness of night, conversations grew heavier, punctuated by knocks at doors that no one wanted to answer. The early days blurred into a haze of rumors and contradictions. Some said the unrest would pass in weeks, that the government would tighten its grip, and things would return to normal. Others whispered that nothing would ever be the same. Families tuned into foreign news stations in secret, straining to make sense of reports that seemed both too distant and too close. In some homes, televisions flickered with images of protests, but the sound was kept low, almost muted, as if raising the volume might invite danger. In Syria, even sound had become suspect. And yet, for all the uncertainty, the invisible line had already been crossed. Once blood is shed, there is no turning back. A bullet fired into a crowd cannot be undone. A boy beaten and arrested cannot be restored to innocence. A mother's wail cannot be unheard. These moments mark the passage from unrest to conflict, from dissent to war. They are small in number at first, but each one leaves a scar, and together they accumulate into something far larger than the sum of their parts. For outsiders, Syria's descent into war could be plotted on charts, explained through political analysis, traced across maps with shifting front lines. But inside Syria, the descent was experienced in more intimate, more insidious ways. The baker who closed his shop after soldiers demanded free bread. The teacher who taught her last class before the school was turned into a barracks. The neighbor who vanished one morning, leaving behind an unlocked door and unanswered questions. These were the first fractures of a society unraveling. And as the fractures spread, so too did the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear, the silence where people learned to say nothing when soldiers passed by, to avert their eyes at checkpoints, to withhold even the smallest truths from their children. In this silence, survival became a performance. Families rehearsed their neutrality, their obedience, their silence, as though silence itself might shield them from harm. But silence is never an armor strong enough to stop the blast of a shell or the raid of a midnight patrol. The hidden human tragedy was already taking shape. It lived in the decisions that no one wanted to make. Which child to send for bread when the streets were dangerous? Which belongings to carry if forced to flee in the night? Whether to risk speaking a forbidden word in exchange for the fragile dignity of truth. These choices, impossible yet inescapable, began to define daily existence. Consider the story of a father in Homs. He owned a small electronics shop, selling radios, light bulbs, and batteries. When the protests began, he kept his store open, hoping business might continue despite the chaos. One afternoon, soldiers marched down his street, firing into the air, scattering crowds. A stray bullet shattered his shop window. He swept up the glass, boarded the window, and opened again the next day. Days later, the soldiers returned, and this time they entered his store. They demanded supplies, confiscating radios and batteries, calling it security needs. He protested, softly, carefully, but his protest was met with the butt of a rifle across his face. He closed his store that evening and never reopened. He told his wife, "It is no longer my shop. It belongs to the war now." This small story, repeated countless times across Syria, is the true marrow of conflict. It is not only the destruction of buildings, but the erosion of livelihoods, the unraveling of continuity, the transformation of life into survival. The hidden tragedy is that war makes ordinary existence impossible, replacing it with a new reality where every gesture is shadowed by risk. And still, life continued. Weddings were held, though smaller and quieter. Babies were born, their cries mingling with the distant rumble of artillery. Children played, fashioning toys from scraps, turning war into their backdrop rather than their subject. Resilience was not a choice but a necessity, a stubborn insistence that even in ruin, life must go on. Yet even this resilience carried an eerie undertone, for to continue living amid destruction is to live in defiance of the abyss. The silence of Syria is layered with paradoxes. It is at once suffocating and deafening, protective and dangerous. It shields families from suspicion, yet it allows atrocities to go unnoticed. It hides suffering, yet it also preserves fragments of dignity. And through this silence, the world looked on, often failing to hear the voices buried beneath. News reports spoke of civil unrest, armed conflict, regional instability. Words chosen for their neutrality, their vagueness, their distance. These words were safer than the truth. They created the illusion of understanding while hiding the magnitude of what was happening. They obscured the faces behind the numbers, the humanity behind the statistics. But beneath the language, beneath the headlines, people whispered their truths into cameras, into notebooks, into the ears of those they trusted. These whispers, fragile and often fleeting, are the ones that reveal the hidden human tragedy most clearly. One young woman recorded a video in her kitchen, her scarf pulled tightly around her face. In a trembling voice, she described the disappearance of her brother. Soldiers had taken him one night, accusing him of aiding protesters. Her family searched for him in prisons, in hospitals, in morgues, but he was nowhere to be found. In the video, she held up a photograph of him, his face frozen in a school portrait, smiling awkwardly. She whispered, "If you see him, tell him we are waiting." Her plea traveled across borders, uploaded online, shared in distant countries by people who would never meet her, who would never know her fate. That video may be all that remains of her voice. These fragments, the closed shop, the vanished brother, the silenced prayers, are the fabric of the prologue. They remind us that the Syrian Civil War did not erupt fully formed, but crept in, piece by piece, unraveling the ordinary until nothing familiar remained. As we move deeper into the story, it becomes clear that the tragedy is not hidden because it is invisible, but because it is overwhelming. To confront the full scope of Syria's suffering is to confront the failure of empathy, the limits of attention, the fragility of human concern. It is easier to turn away, to let the silence cover it. And yet, the silence hums, insistent, like a low vibration beneath the surface of our consciousness. The prologue of Syria's war is therefore not only a story of Syria. It is a mirror held up to the world, reflecting how easily we allow suffering to become background noise, how quickly we reduce human lives to abstractions. It is a warning that tragedy thrives in silence, and that silence is often of our own making. Listen closely, then. The war has not yet fully begun in this telling, but already the air is heavy, charged with what is to come. The silence deepens, and within it, the hidden human tragedy waits, patient, unrelenting, a shadow stretching into the chapters ahead. As months folded into years, the early hopes of reform were swallowed by fire. What had begun as chants for dignity had transformed into the thunder of artillery, the shriek of warplanes, and the endless procession of funerals. Yet even here, in the prologue of Syria's war, we must pause, not to recount battles or strategies, but to dwell on the hidden heartbeat of the tragedy, the ordinary lives lost to extraordinary violence. A child in Damascus once carried his school bag through the streets, clutching a notebook filled with handwriting only half-formed. His dreams were simple: to learn, to play, to grow into a man who might one day work in his father's shop. But on an afternoon when the sound of aircraft filled the sky, that notebook was left behind on the pavement, its pages fluttering in the dust. His name may never appear in history books, yet his absence marks the silence that hangs over countless Syrian families. A grandmother in Aleppo used to rise before dawn to prepare bread, kneading dough with hands calloused by years of repetition. When flour grew scarce, she cut the loaves smaller, stretching them thin, praying her grandchildren would not notice. Later, when the bakery itself was reduced to rubble, she sat in her doorway holding an empty bowl, whispering the recipes of her youth into the air, as if memory itself could feed her family. Her ritual, too, is part of the hidden war. And in a refugee camp far from home, a young man strummed a broken oud, his fingers coaxing fractured melodies from strings that refused to stay in tune. Around him, others gathered, listening, their faces lit by the faint glow of firelight. They did not sing loudly, for fear of drawing attention, but they hummed along, softly, carrying pieces of Syria in their voices. In exile, even music became an act of survival. These fragments, scattered like shards of glass, tell us more about the human cost of Syria than any ledger of statistics. They are small, fragile, and often overlooked, yet together they form a mosaic of suffering, resilience, and loss. To see them is to understand that war is not one story, but millions, each interrupted, each silenced before its time. The world, meanwhile, grew accustomed to Syria's pain. At first, the images shocked, the smoldering ruins, the bloodied children carried through streets, the cries of families torn apart. But over time, the images blended into a relentless stream, indistinguishable from one another. Compassion fatigued. Outrage dulled. The war became background noise, a distant echo in a world preoccupied with its own crises. This is perhaps the cruelest tragedy of all, not only that Syrians endured such suffering, but that much of the world allowed their suffering to become invisible. Silence became the war's most faithful companion. Silence in the chambers of power, where resolutions were drafted and red lines debated but seldom enforced. Silence in neighborhoods where neighbors once gathered, now reduced to whispers of suspicion and grief. Silence in refugee camps, where dreams dissolved into endless waiting. Silence in mass graves, where names and stories disappeared into the earth. And yet, even silence speaks. It speaks in the hollow eyes of children who have seen too much. It speaks in the cracked walls of homes abandoned mid-meal, plates still on the table. It speaks in the pauses between news broadcasts, when the screen fades to black but the war continues on, unheard. The silence of Syria is not empty, it is haunted. As we close this prologue, it is important to remember that what lies ahead in this telling is not a clean narrative. It will not unfold neatly, for war is never neat. It is tangled, chaotic, contradictory. The Syrian Civil War is a labyrinth of suffering, where every path leads deeper into shadows. But this labyrinth must be entered. For to ignore it is to consent to silence. To look away is to become complicit in the erasure of millions of lives. This story demands to be told, not in the language of numbers and strategies, but in the trembling voices of those who lived it. The hidden human tragedy of Syria is not confined to the borders of the nation. It seeps outward, into the conscience of humanity itself. It challenges the way we measure value, the way we define responsibility, the way we remember, or forget, those who suffer beyond our sight. To meditate on Syria is to meditate on ourselves, on the fragility of our compassion, on the eerie silence that so often follows the cries of others. And so, we begin. The prologue closes with shadows lengthening over the land, silence pressing against the walls of cities, whispers rising into fragile defiance. What follows will not be easy. It will not comfort. But it will reveal. The war in Syria is a wound still open, a song still unfinished, a silence still speaking. For the hidden human tragedy, overlooked by much of the world, will now unfold before you, slowly, hauntingly, insistently, demanding that you listen, even when the silence threatens to lull you into forgetting. Before the first protest banners were raised, before the slogans rang out in the streets, Syria was a land suspended between silence and unease. For decades, the Assad family had ruled with an iron grip, the weight of authority pressing down upon every household, every whisper, every classroom. It was a silence so profound that many mistook it for stability. Beneath it, however, currents of frustration, resentment, and longing stirred restlessly. Bashar al-Assad, the younger son who inherited power after the death of his father Hafez in 2000, was initially greeted with a cautious hope. Many Syrians, particularly the young, imagined that his Western education and gentle demeanor might soften the old regime. They dreamed that he would peel away the suffocating layers of repression, opening the country to reform, to freedom, to possibility. For a fleeting moment, the so-called Damascus Spring offered glimpses of debate and expression. Cafes filled with intellectuals daring to speak more freely, newspapers testing the boundaries of censorship, ordinary citizens whispering that perhaps a new era had arrived. But the spring was short-lived. By 2001, the state reasserted its control. The brief experiment with openness collapsed beneath arrests, intimidation, and renewed censorship. The old habits of fear returned, but they returned with an added bitterness, the bitterness of hope betrayed. Syria became, once more, a place where dissent was suffocated before it could breathe, where prisons brimmed with those who dared to speak too loudly, where children grew up watching their parents carefully measure each word. This was the Syria that entered 2011, restless, watchful, weary. Its people carried wounds that could not be seen, wounds of humiliation, poverty, corruption, and a suffocating absence of choice. Yet, for many, the silence held. Until one day, it cracked. The Arab Spring had swept through Tunisia and Egypt with breathtaking speed, toppling leaders who had seemed immovable. On televisions across Syria, images of jubilant crowds filled city squares, chanting for freedom, demanding the fall of regimes. Young Syrians watched with awe and envy, their own hearts quickening with the thought, if they could, why not us? The air was charged with a possibility so fragile that even speaking of it aloud felt dangerous. But it could not be contained. In March 2011, in the southern city of Dara, a group of schoolboys, barely teenagers, scrawled graffiti on a wall. Their message was simple, echoing the slogans from across the Arab world: the people want the fall of the regime. To outsiders, it might have seemed childish, almost trivial. But in a land where every word was monitored, it was an act of profound defiance. The authorities reacted with fury. The boys were arrested, dragged into detention, and tortured. Their fingernails torn out, their bodies beaten, their innocence violated. When their families pleaded for their release, a government official is said to have mocked them, "Forget your children. Go home and make new ones." The insult was too much. What began as whispers erupted into cries. Families, neighbors, and citizens filled the streets of Dara, demanding not only the release of the boys but an end to corruption, an end to repression, an end to the casual cruelty of power. Their chants were bold, their footsteps heavy with defiance. The silence of decades fractured into shouts that could no longer be contained. The regime's response was swift and brutal. Security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters. Bullets tore into crowds that had gathered with nothing more than voices and banners. Blood spilled onto the streets of Dara, staining the dust with the price of defiance. Funerals followed, and the funerals themselves became protests. Each death was met with greater resolve, each crackdown with greater outrage. The cycle began, unstoppable and consuming. News of Dara spread quickly, carried on whispers, on cell phone videos smuggled past censors, on satellite broadcasts that the regime could not fully silence. Across Syria, towns and cities stirred. In Homs, in Hama, in Damascus itself, citizens began to gather. They shouted for dignity, for freedom, for justice. At first, their demands were modest: reforms, accountability, the release of prisoners. But the regime's violence radicalized their hopes. What had begun as calls for reform became, increasingly, calls for the fall of the Assad family altogether. The protests were not uniform. In some places, they were small and tentative, scattered gatherings quickly dispersed by police. In others, they swelled into thousands, filling mosques and squares with defiance. What united them was a sense that something long frozen had begun to melt, that the fear which had governed Syria for decades was no longer absolute. People had seen the wall crack, and they pressed harder, sensing that freedom might be within reach. But fear did not disappear. It lingered in every corner, woven into every chant. Protesters marched knowing that they risked imprisonment, torture, or death. Mothers wept as their sons joined the crowds, fearing they would never return. Families whispered final goodbyes before stepping into the streets, unsure if they would live to see another day. The courage of protest in Syria was not the courage of those who believed they could not be harmed. It was the courage of those who knew harm was certain but chose to march anyway. And so the first sparks flew, small but incendiary. Dara became a symbol, a wound, a rallying cry. Its name was whispered in classrooms, repeated in marketplaces, invoked in mosques. The story of the tortured boys spread like fire, igniting anger far beyond the city's borders. Dara was no longer just a place, it was a question thrust into the heart of Syria: how much longer can we remain silent? The regime, accustomed to ruling through fear, miscalculated. Each act of violence, each crackdown, each funeral procession tightened the knot of resistance rather than untying it. Assad and his circle imagined they could crush dissent as they always had, through brutality, intimidation, and silence. But this time, something was different. The world was watching, and Syrians themselves had glimpsed the possibility of change. The more blood was shed, the less possible silence became. For those who lived through those early months, memory carries the rhythm of chants echoing off stone walls, the sight of banners painted in haste, the trembling of hands clasped in unity. It carries the terror of gunfire shattering the air, the grief of bodies carried aloft by mourners, the resilience of crowds returning again and again despite the danger. In these memories, the tragedy of Syria's war begins not with armies and strategies, but with voices, fragile, determined, and brave enough to break the silence of generations. What began in Dara was not only a protest, it was an awakening. And awakenings, once begun, are difficult to reverse. The days following Dara's first protests became a crucible. The air in the city was thick with grief and defiance, as if every breath was laced with the memory of the children's cries and the sting of bullets in the crowd. Funerals turned into processions, processions into demonstrations, and demonstrations into running battles with the security forces. The streets became a stage where sorrow and courage danced side by side, each new burial fueling another wave of resistance. Syrian history had seen uprisings before. The ghosts of Hama in 1982 still haunted the nation, when Hafez al-Assad's regime crushed a revolt with artillery and tanks, leaving tens of thousands dead. The regime expected that memory alone would serve as a warning, that Syrians would remember the devastation of Hama and hold their tongues, too frightened to repeat the past. But time had softened fear into defiance. A new generation, too young to remember the ruins of Hama but old enough to feel the weight of repression, refused to be governed by their parents' silence. The chants grew louder. Ash Shab Yurid Nim. The people want the fall of the regime. The slogan that had echoed from Tunis to Cairo now reverberated through Syrian streets, carried by voices that once trembled with hesitation but now rang with conviction. For every bullet fired, 10 new voices joined the chorus. The regime's attempt to terrify the public instead awakened a shared determination. If blood had already been spilled, it could not be in vain. In Damascus, the capital, protests began to surface in neighborhoods long considered loyal to the regime. University students whispered of marches planned in secret, slipping through alleyways to gather in numbers that might defy the ever-watchful eyes of the security police. In mosques, imams risked everything by allowing their congregations to spill into the streets after Friday prayers. The city that once seemed untouchable, the heart of Assad's power, began to quiver with unrest. Homs, too, emerged as a center of defiance. Known as the capital of the revolution, its streets became rivers of protesters, young men and women chanting with a ferocity that startled even seasoned observers. The city bore a spirit that was both communal and defiant, as neighbors banded together to shield one another from the batons and bullets of security forces. Makeshift banners fluttered in the breeze, painted hastily with demands for freedom and dignity. Even when live fire tore through the gatherings, the people of Homs returned, night after night, unwilling to bow. The regime's violence escalated in tandem with the protests. Security forces raided homes, dragging men from their families in the dead of night. Torture centers overflowed with detainees whose only crime was raising their voices. Mothers waited outside prisons, clutching photographs of their missing sons, their faces etched with lines of worry and despair. In some cities, tanks rolled through narrow streets, their presence both a show of force and a chilling reminder of the regime's readiness to escalate. And yet, the protests spread. Each crackdown inspired another city to rise, another neighborhood to rebel. Latakia, Hama, Idlib, Aleppo, towns and villages that had long seemed quiet now erupted with defiance. The repression only reinforced the sense that Syria had crossed a threshold, that the silence of decades could no longer be restored. For the protesters, each chant carried both hope and dread. Hope, because they had tasted the power of collective action, the intoxicating possibility that the regime could fall just as Mubarak had fallen in Egypt. Dread, because they knew the regime's ruthlessness, its arsenal of violence, its history of crushing dissent without mercy. Every step into the streets was a gamble with fate, a wager that their voices could outweigh bullets. The international community watched with cautious attention. News networks replayed shaky cell phone footage of protests, the sound of gunfire crackling in the background, the shouts of demonstrators blending with screams of panic. Analysts speculated whether Assad could withstand the wave that had swept away other Arab leaders, or whether his regime would prove more durable, more brutal, more unyielding. For many Syrians, however, the question was not whether the world believed in them, it was whether they could endure what was coming. Inside Syria, fear clashed with exhilaration. In the same household, one sibling might beg another not to join the protests, terrified of losing them, while the other argued that silence meant surrender. Families were split between the instinct for survival and the hunger for freedom. Each march became a test of loyalty not only to one's ideals but to one's loved ones. To march was to risk leaving behind grieving parents, widowed spouses, orphan children. To stay home was to watch history pass by and wonder forever whether courage might have made a difference. The chants echoed not only in Arabic but in the language of longing. Freedom! Freedom! Protesters shouted the word with a force that seemed to shake the dust from the buildings around them. It was a word many Syrians had never dared to utter in public, now shouted until voices went hoarse. The word became a lifeline, a beacon in the gathering storm. Yet beneath the chants lurked an unease that few dared to articulate. The uprising was spreading faster than anyone expected, but it was spreading into a country riddled with divisions, sectarian, regional, political. The Assad regime had long manipulated these divisions, pitting communities against one another, ensuring that no single group could rise without fear of being isolated. Alawites, Sunnis, Christians, Druze, all carried different anxieties, different fears of what might come if the regime fell. For some, the protests symbolized liberation. For others, they threatened chaos, revenge, the collapse of fragile coexistence. In the early months, these divisions remained mostly dormant, as the protests emphasized unity. One, "The Syrian people are one," became a common chant, a desperate assertion that sectarian lines could be erased in pursuit of freedom. In the crowded streets, it felt true. Sunnis and Christians marched side by side, Alawite dissidents risked their lives to join the chants, Kurdish voices blended into the chorus. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed possible that Syria could rise as one. But the regime knew otherwise. It had thrived by cultivating mistrust, by reminding minorities that the fall of Assad might mean their own downfall. As the protests grew, so too did the regime's efforts to sow division, whispering fears of sectarian violence, hinting at conspiracies, painting the uprising as a threat not just to Assad but to Syria's survival. This narrative began to seep into conversations, into the quiet hesitations of families, into the uncertainty of communities already fragile with mistrust. Still, the protests surged. Each day seemed to carry with it a sense of both momentum and doom. Protesters whispered to each other that the regime could not kill everyone, that their numbers would protect them, that the tide of history was on their side. But behind those whispers lay darker thoughts. What if the regime can kill enough? What if this path leads not to freedom, but to destruction? The first martyrs of the revolution became symbols. Posters bearing their faces appeared in demonstrations, their names shouted in unison, their deaths memorialized as fuel for the movement. Parents who had lost children to bullets or prison stood in front of crowds, holding photographs aloft, their grief transformed into defiance. The personal became political, the political became personal. It was in these early months, amid both the swelling of hope and the deepening of grief, that Syria began to slide irreversibly toward conflict. What began as graffiti on a wall, as chants in the streets of Dara, had become a nationwide uprising. And though no one yet spoke of civil war, the shadows of that future were already lengthening across the horizon. Syria's silence had been broken. But what lay ahead was not the freedom so many had dreamed of. It was something far darker, far more enduring, far more tragic. The uprising spread like ripples across water, unpredictable yet inevitable, reaching even the smallest corners of Syria. Villages that had never seen protest in decades suddenly found themselves echoing with chants. Farmers left their fields, merchants shuttered their shops, and students abandoned their classrooms to join the swelling tide of demonstrations. There was a sense, however fleeting, that the people were discovering their collective strength, that a curtain long draped across the nation was finally being drawn aside. Yet with every march came the haunting sound of gunfire. The regime's forces were not subtle. They did not merely arrest or intimidate, they shot to kill. Snipers appeared on rooftops, their rifles trained on crowds of unarmed civilians. Their bullets found targets indiscriminately, men, women, even children. The randomness was deliberate, for terror is most effective when it is unpredictable. Each time a protester fell, their body became both a warning and a rallying cry. In the city of Homs, Friday prayers became the heartbeat of the movement. Every week, worshippers poured out of mosques and into the streets, their chants echoing down avenues lined with crumbling facades. Residents draped the Syrian flag from balconies, painted graffiti on walls, and carried banners proclaiming their refusal to be silenced. But every Friday also brought blood. Security forces fired tear gas, live rounds, and sometimes even artillery into the throngs. The city's narrow streets became clogged with smoke and cries, the soundscape of defiance woven with the sound of mourning. Still, Homs endured. Neighbors transformed their homes into makeshift clinics. Women stitched banners from bed sheets and passed water to demonstrators gasping through clouds of tear gas. The city began to earn its reputation as the capital of the revolution, a place where fear could not extinguish courage. To the people of Homs, the cost of silence had become greater than the cost of rebellion. Elsewhere, the story repeated itself with variations of pain and bravery. In Hama, a city still haunted by the massacre of 1982, tens of thousands gathered in its central square, their chants reverberating like thunder. For a moment, it felt as though history itself had been undone, that the shadow of Hafez al-Assad's brutal suppression had been lifted. But the son proved no less ruthless than the father. In the summer of 2011, Bashar's forces surrounded Hama, cutting off water, electricity, and supplies. Tanks rolled into its neighborhoods, artillery pounded its streets, and the echoes of 1982 returned with terrifying clarity. The resilience of protesters was not simply an act of defiance, it was also a way of reclaiming humanity in a landscape that sought to strip it away. In towns where demonstrations persisted, songs filled the air, old folk tunes reborn with revolutionary lyrics, poetry recited in hushed gatherings, voices rising not only in anger but in hope. The revolution had a rhythm, a music of its own, haunting yet uplifting, like a lullaby whispered into a storm. And yet, beneath the chants and songs, despair lurked. Parents watched their children walk into protests with fear knotted in their stomachs. Young men carried not only banners but also the weight of knowing they might never return. Some families made quiet preparations, hiding money, food, or documents, unsure if exile would soon become their only path to survival. The protest movement was vibrant, yes, but it was also fragile, balancing on the edge of catastrophe. The world beyond Syria watched but hesitated. Images of bloodied bodies and mass funerals reached global screens, sparking outrage and condemnation. Statements of concern poured in from world leaders. Yet, action remained elusive. For Syrians, it became clear that while the world might watch their suffering, it was unlikely to intervene in a way that could protect them. The loneliness of their struggle grew heavier. Inside the regime's inner circle, paranoia deepened. Assad appeared on television, dismissing the protests as the work of foreign conspirators, armed gangs, and terrorists. He painted the uprising not as a cry for freedom but as a threat to Syria's sovereignty. His words were designed not only for the international stage but also for domestic consumption, to reassure loyalists and sow doubt among the uncertain. Many Syrians who feared chaos or sectarian collapse clung to his narrative, preferring the cruel certainty of dictatorship over the unknown abyss of revolution. Still, the uprising surged. Protesters painted the word Hurriya, freedom, on walls, on banners, on their very skin. They chanted it until their voices cracked, until the word itself seemed to vibrate in the air, a presence too strong to erase. Freedom had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be unsaid. As the months passed, the protests transformed. What began as peaceful marches began to collide with the reality of escalating violence. Some demonstrators, unwilling to remain defenseless in the face of live fire, began to hurl stones or makeshift firebombs. Others whispered of taking up arms, of defending their neighborhoods against the regime's forces. The line between protest and resistance began to blur. In the hills and countryside, deserters from the Syrian army began to appear. Young conscripts, ordered to fire on their own people, chose instead to flee, carrying their rifles with them. They found refuge in sympathetic villages, where locals offered them shelter, food, and anonymity. These deserters spoke of forming groups, not yet armies, not yet organized, but fragments of resistance that foreshadowed a darker, more violent turn. But in these early months, the protests still held the fragile beauty of collective courage. Entire communities gathered at night, lighting candles and releasing balloons, their small gestures of hope shining briefly against the darkness. Children painted their dreams of freedom on scraps of paper. Women led chants that shook the courtyards of mosques. Old men wept openly in the streets, overcome with the memory of freedoms they had never known. It was an awakening, but awakenings are rarely gentle. In the background, the machinery of repression churned relentlessly, preparing for the escalation that would follow. Prisons swelled with the disappeared. Neighborhoods fell silent as families mourned the missing. Streets once alive with chants now carried the echo of boots and the rumble of tanks. The revolution had begun, but its future was uncertain, and its cost was already unbearable. By the end of 2011, the spark lit in Dara had become a wildfire. And though many still clung to the dream that peaceful protest could prevail, the shadow of war was already creeping across Syria's horizon, quiet but undeniable, like smoke rising from distant hills. As 2011 deepened into autumn, the air of Syria seemed permanently altered. The chants, the bullets, the funerals, the endless cycle of defiance and repression, these rhythms became the new pulse of daily life. Entire communities lived in a state of suspension, caught between the exhilaration of newfound courage and the suffocating dread of what might come next. Evenings in Syria became hushed rituals of both fear and resilience. Families gathered around flickering television sets or radios, waiting for word of the latest protests and the latest crackdowns. Internet access, where it existed, became both a lifeline and a weapon, as shaky videos of demonstrations and atrocities made their way across the digital world. The young especially clung to their phones as if they were sacred relics, their small screens windows into a truth that state media sought to smother. In Damascus, the capital, the contrast between appearance and reality was especially stark. Official channels broadcast images of stability, of calm streets and loyal citizens, while just beyond the gaze of the cameras, tear gas and bullets punctuated nights of unrest. The city lived in duality, restaurants open yet half empty, marketplaces bustling yet tense, neighborhoods whispering of demonstrations even as soldiers patrolled nearby. Fear was everywhere, but so too was defiance, woven into the very fabric of daily existence. The regime's tactics evolved as the months passed. No longer content with random arrests and intimidation, they deployed overwhelming force. Tanks appeared in towns and villages, rolling down narrow streets with engines that growled like beasts from another world. Soldiers erected checkpoints, cutting neighborhoods into cages, while artillery thundered into residential areas under the pretext of restoring order. The presence of the military was not just physical, it was psychological, a constant reminder that the state could crush at will. Yet protests endured. In Homs, residents organized Freedom Fridays, each week given a new name: Friday of Steadfastness, Friday of Martyrs, Friday of No Return. The names themselves became symbols of determination, declarations that even in the face of slaughter, Syrians refused to retreat. These gatherings carried an almost liturgical quality, rituals of defiance performed with bodies, voices, and tears. The protests were not simply political acts, they were cultural awakenings. Poetry once confined to whispered recitations now rang openly in public squares. Traditional songs, repurposed with revolutionary verses, spread like wildfire, their melodies carrying defiance from one town to the next. Graffiti bloomed on walls like wildflowers in concrete deserts, each word a fragile yet fierce proclamation of humanity. In these creative expressions, Syrians reclaimed the dignity long stripped from them, even if only for fleeting moments. But every act of expression carried risk. Artists and poets were imprisoned, their works deemed threats to national security. Doctors who treated wounded protesters were arrested for aiding terrorists. Children who chanted in the streets were torn from their families, punished as examples to others. The regime's violence was not random, it was strategic, designed to break not only bodies but the very spirit of resistance. Still, the resistance deepened. Families of the disappeared, once too frightened to speak, began to gather in silent vigils, holding up photographs of loved ones whose fate was unknown. These gatherings, quiet yet unyielding, were perhaps the most haunting protests of all, rows of faces staring from photographs, demanding recognition in a country where erasure had long been a weapon. By winter, whispers of armed resistance grew louder. Groups of defectors calling themselves the Free Syrian Army began to surface in border regions, particularly near Turkey. At first, they were small bands of deserters armed with little more than stolen rifles and conviction. Their mission was not to wage war but to protect protesters, to shield communities from the relentless brutality of the regime's forces. But their very existence marked a turning point. The uprising was no longer purely unarmed. The path toward militarization, however reluctant, had begun. This shift was not celebrated by all. Many Syrians clung fiercely to the principle of nonviolence, believing that taking up arms would only invite greater bloodshed and play into the regime's narrative of terrorists and conspirators. Activists argued bitterly among themselves: was resistance without weapons noble or naive? Was picking up arms a betrayal of their cause or the only path to survival? These debates raged in living rooms and safe houses, in refugee camps and clandestine meetings, unresolved yet urgent. Meanwhile, the humanitarian cost mounted. Refugees began to trickle across borders, seeking safety in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Families fled their homes in the dead of night, carrying only what they could fit into their arms. Villages emptied, their silence a haunting reminder of lives uprooted. Camps sprang up along borders, filled with people who had never imagined leaving their homes yet now found themselves stateless, reduced to waiting for aid in tents that flapped in cold winds. Children bore the weight of the revolution in ways they could not yet understand. Some were orphaned, others scarred by violence, their laughter muted by trauma. Teachers tried to hold classes in basements, but lessons were interrupted by gunfire and shelling. Childhood itself became a casualty, replaced by the language of loss and survival. As the year drew to a close, it was clear that Syria had passed a point of no return. The protests had not been crushed, they had spread too far, taken root too deeply in the collective spirit of the people. Yet they had also not succeeded in bringing down the regime. Instead, the uprising had entered a deadly stalemate, a government determined to cling to power at any cost, and a population unwilling to surrender despite the price they were paying. The tragedy of Syria was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was written in the blood on the streets of Dara, Homs, Hama, Damascus, and countless villages whose names might never reach the outside world. It was etched into the faces of mothers clutching photographs, into the chants that echoed from minarets, into the silence of classrooms where desks sat empty. And yet, within that tragedy lay a haunting beauty, the beauty of defiance, of voices raised against impossible odds, of a people who chose to dream even when nightmares closed in around them. The spark in the dust had not only ignited fire, it had illuminated the hidden strength of a nation long silenced. But fire consumes. And as the embers of 2011 glowed into the darkness of 2012, the world would soon witness how quickly those sparks could spread into a blaze that would engulf not just Syria, but the conscience of humanity itself. The year 2012 dawned over Syria with a chill that seemed to seep not only from the winter air but from the atmosphere of despair and defiance that gripped the land. By then, what had begun as a wave of demonstrations had hardened into something darker, more enduring, and infinitely more perilous. The uprising no longer resembled the protests of Tunisia or Egypt, where rapid political shifts had toppled long-standing rulers in months. Syria had entered a slower, bloodier crucible. The chants for dignity remained, but they were now accompanied by the drumbeat of artillery fire. The first days of January bore witness to a shift in the very texture of the conflict. In towns like Homs, Idlib, and Dara, protests were still held, voices still rose defiantly, but the state's response had escalated to a new level of ferocity. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off, encircled by tanks and checkpoints, suffocated like prey in a predator's jaws. The Syrian military no longer contented itself with firing on demonstrators, it now laid siege to communities, cutting off food, medicine, electricity, and water. Civilians, once confident they could at least endure, suddenly found themselves trapped in warlike conditions. At night, The sky over Homs glowed with the orange of artillery shells, the explosions shaking buildings like earthquakes. Families huddled in basements, whispering prayers while walls shuddered around them. Candles burned low as mothers tried to distract children with stories, their voices trembling with each distant blast. The soundscape of the city had transformed. Where once there were calls to prayer and vendors shouting in markets, now there were the crackle of gunfire, the wail of sirens, and the hollow thud of mortars. It was here, in Homs, that the world began to recognize the revolution's tragic metamorphosis. Protesters, no longer content to march unarmed into the crosshairs of soldiers, began to seek protection from those willing to fight back. The Free Syrian Army, still an infant force of defectors and volunteers, made its presence felt most strongly in this city. They were not yet an organized army but a collection of small brigades, armed with smuggled rifles, captured machine guns, and determination. Their goal was modest: defend the people, not overthrow the state in a single strike. But their mere existence marked a line in the sand. The uprising had entered the realm of armed conflict. The Syrian regime, unsurprisingly, exploited this shift. On state television, officials declared, "We are fighting armed gangs and terrorists." They paraded confessions, often extracted under torture, of supposed militants, claiming foreign conspiracies were driving the unrest. To many Syrians, these accusations were laughable. They had seen their neighbors, their children, their brothers dragged off for nothing more than chanting in a square. Yet the state's narrative resonated elsewhere, sowing doubt among those who wished to avoid foreign entanglements. For the people inside Syria, the emergence of the FSA was both a shield and a source of anxiety. Some welcomed the defectors, offering them shelter and bread, whispering blessings for their courage. Others feared the escalation, worried that the regime's reprisals would grow even harsher. And indeed, they did. In neighborhoods where the FSA was rumored to operate, shelling often fell indiscriminately. It became a grim equation: the presence of resistance invited greater destruction, and yet without resistance, civilians remained defenseless. Across the northern countryside, villages began to fracture under this new reality. Sons vanished into the night to join armed brigades, leaving behind mothers torn between pride and terror. Fathers who once farmed their fields now smuggled ammunition or served as lookouts. Young men carved out training camps in abandoned barns and olive groves, their rifles rusty but their spirits unyielding. There was an air of inevitability, as if a society that had endured decades of silence now had no choice but to roar back, even if roaring meant destruction. Meanwhile, in the refugee camps swelling along Syria's borders, the human toll became undeniable. Jordan's Zaatari camp, hastily erected in the desert, began to fill with thousands of Syrians escaping bombardment. In Turkey, tents sprawled in neat rows under military supervision, housing families who still hoped their exile would be temporary. They carried stories of massacres and narrow escapes, their words stitching together a mosaic of suffering that the world could no longer ignore. But the world, though it watched, remained hesitant. Foreign governments issued statements of condemnation, yet meaningful intervention was slow, tangled in the webs of geopolitics. Some nations provided medical aid or humanitarian assistance, while others smuggled small arms to the rebels, but no decisive action materialized. For Syrians under bombardment, these gestures felt like whispers against the roar of violence. They asked, was the world waiting for us to be annihilated before it acted? Inside Syria, the human spirit continued its delicate dance between despair and resilience. In besieged Homs, doctors transformed basements into makeshift hospitals, treating the wounded with threadbare supplies. Volunteers ferried bread and water across sniper-infested streets, knowing that one step too many might end their lives. Teachers, refusing to abandon their roles, held secret classes for children, writing lessons on walls when chalkboards were destroyed. The will to live, to preserve fragments of normalcy, became itself an act of rebellion. At the same time, tragedy multiplied. Reports of massacres filtered out, families slaughtered in their homes, bodies piled in streets, villages erased under shelling. The dead were often buried in hurried graves, ceremonies brief and whispered for fear of discovery. Yet in those moments of mourning, the revolution deepened, each martyr a new wound, each wound a fresh vow that their blood would not be forgotten. By mid-2012, the question was no longer whether Syria was in turmoil, it was whether Syria had descended into full civil war. Analysts hesitated, clinging to the language of unrest and crisis, but Syrians knew the truth. Their daily lives bore the scars of a war that had already begun. They lived in a country fractured, where the regime clung to strongholds, the rebels carved out liberated zones, and civilians were crushed between them. And yet, through all the suffering, the revolution's original spirit lingered. Chants still rose in defiance, though now they were often drowned by gunfire. Flags of independence fluttered above rooftops, painted hastily on walls or stitched by hand. Even in the ruins of bombed-out neighborhoods, voices whispered, "The people want the downfall of the regime." These words, born in peaceful squares, now echoed in the rubble, carrying both memory and hope. For the people of Syria, the transformation was complete. Theirs was no longer simply a struggle for reform, nor merely a movement of protests. It was a war, unwanted, unchosen, but inescapable. The nation had crossed a threshold, and the path ahead promised not salvation but suffering. The fire lit in 2011 now burned uncontrollably, and the world stood at the edge, watching a nation consume itself. Yet within that fire, Syrians still clung to fragments of light. For in every destroyed street, in every whispered prayer, in every act of defiance, they carried the hope that one day the darkness would pass, and their land would rise again, scarred but unbroken. The escalation of violence in 2012 did more than fracture Syria geographically, it fractured it psychologically. Where once the people had clung to the fragile hope that their struggle might end swiftly, now the war settled into the marrow of their lives. Daily routines were reordered around the rhythm of violence. A trip to the bakery became a gamble, crossing a street meant daring fate, and the simple act of boiling water or lighting a candle felt like an act of endurance against a darkness that sought to engulf them. It was in this crucible that neighborhoods transformed into microcosms of resistance and survival. In Aleppo, Syria's commercial heart, shopkeepers closed their doors not for lack of customers but because mortars and airstrikes shattered streets that once thrummed with commerce. Families fled their apartments carrying only what they could lift, abandoning wedding photos, heirlooms, and books, objects that anchored them to a past now unreachable. Some would return weeks later to find their homes reduced to rubble, others never returned at all, their absence carved into the silence of the city. Aleppo's fall into conflict marked a turning point. Until then, the city had remained relatively untouched, its residents skeptical of the uprising's reach. But by mid-2012, the battle for Aleppo raged with ferocity. The rebels had entered, carving out footholds, while the regime responded with overwhelming firepower. Barrel bombs, crude, indiscriminate weapons, tumbled from helicopters, reducing entire blocks to dust. Each detonation sent shockwaves through the air, collapsing not only buildings but the fragile illusion that Syria's great cities might be spared. The human tragedy of Aleppo became a symbol for the world. Footage smuggled out revealed scenes almost biblical in their devastation, families clutching one another amid burning streets, children pulled from rubble caked in blood and dust, entire markets transformed into charred skeletons of commerce. Yet beyond the spectacle, daily life still flickered. Teachers taught classes in basements, families cooked what little they had over fires made from splintered furniture, and whispers of poetry and prayer wound their way through the ruins. In war, survival itself became art. Elsewhere, in Homs, the siege deepened. Baba Amr, a neighborhood that had become synonymous with resistance, was pounded relentlessly. Foreign journalists smuggled into the district told stories of unimaginable suffering, of neighborhoods without food or medicine, of children buried hastily, of mothers clutching the lifeless forms of their sons. The death of journalist Marie Colvin and photographer Remy Aklik in February 2012 while reporting from Baba Amr underscored the danger and drew global attention, but for residents, theirs was not a story of headlines, it was a story of survival measured by hours, sometimes by minutes. As cities fell to ruin, the rural areas transformed into lifelines and battlegrounds. Olive groves and wheat fields became both refuge and risk, offering food to starving families but also concealing fighters and drawing the regime's wrath. Villages across Idlib and Hama found themselves caught in the crossfire, their inhabitants bombarded by artillery or displaced into sprawling refugee camps. What had once been landscapes of agriculture and life became scarred with trenches, checkpoints, and graves. The war's cruel arithmetic intensified with the spread of sectarian divisions. The regime, dominated by Alawite elites loyal to Assad, painted the rebellion as a Sunni uprising laced with extremism. In turn, some rebel groups framed the struggle in sectarian terms, stoking fears and resentments. Communities that had lived side by side for generations now eyed each other with suspicion. Mosques became rallying points not just for prayer but for mobilization, and the rhetoric of faith was weaponized to bind some together while alienating others. What had begun as a broad cry for dignity risked disintegrating into a fractured struggle defined by identity as much as politics. Yet amid the growing polarization, voices for unity persisted. Activists called for solidarity across sectarian lines, reminding Syrians that their true enemy was tyranny, not their neighbors. Stories surfaced of Christian families sheltering Muslim rebels, of Druze villagers feeding Sunni refugees, of communities resisting the pull of division. But these stories, though powerful, struggled against the weight of violence and fear. Each massacre, each atrocity, pushed the people further apart. By late 2012, Syria was no longer merely a country in crisis, it was a battlefield attracting the world's attention. Regional powers dipped their hands into the conflict, some supporting the rebels with weapons and funds, others backing Assad to maintain their interests. Foreign fighters began to trickle into Syria, drawn by ideology, ambition, or desperation. The revolution, once deeply Syrian in its essence, risked being overtaken by forces far beyond the control of those who first marched in the streets. The civilian cost grew unbearable. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, their corridors slick with blood and echoing with screams. Doctors and nurses worked until collapse, improvising surgeries with tools never meant for war. Some hospitals were deliberately targeted, transforming sanctuaries of healing into graves. Schools, too, became ruins. Children who should have been learning their alphabets now learned the sound of warplanes, the difference between mortar fire and artillery. An entire generation's innocence was torn away, leaving scars that would outlast the conflict itself. And still, despite it all, life persisted in stubborn defiance. Weddings were held in basements, laughter mingled with the thud of distant shells. Mothers told bedtime stories even when dawn felt uncertain. Young men painted slogans on shattered walls, their words a reminder that even in ruin, voices could not be silenced. Each act of endurance, however small, declared, "We are still here." But the war was only beginning. The full descent into chaos, the rise of extremist factions, the chemical attacks, the great exodus of refugees, the grinding stalemate that would stretch for years, lay ahead. In 2012, the Syrian people stood at a threshold, their revolution transformed into war, their voices drowned in fire, their dignity pursued at the highest imaginable cost. The world watched as Syria burned, some with sympathy, some with indifference, others with cold calculation. And within Syria, the people carried on, not because they had chosen this path, but because there was no path left unscarred. They walked forward into the abyss, carrying with them the last embers of hope, even as the darkness deepened. That the Syrian Civil War was no longer a question of protests or reform, but of survival itself. The nation had crossed irreversibly into war, and the hidden human tragedy had only just begun to unfold. The dawn of 2013 revealed a Syria scarred beyond recognition. Cities once alive with trade and laughter now stood hollowed by fire, their streets lined with rubble and their skies thick with smoke. The uprising that began with chants for dignity had evolved, then twisted, into something darker, a war without end, its nature shifting with each passing month. Into this fractured landscape crept the seeds of extremism. They did not arrive suddenly, nor did they dominate at once. Rather, they emerged quietly, growing in the cracks left behind by destruction, despair, and abandonment. For as neighborhoods crumbled under bombs and civilians cried out for protection, the absence of decisive international intervention created fertile soil for groups promising salvation, however grim their methods. In the northern countryside, whispers began of unfamiliar fighters, men with foreign accents, wielding weapons of higher quality than the ragged Free Syrian Army brigades could muster. They arrived in battered trucks, carrying black flags that contrasted starkly against the dust of ruined villages. Their rhetoric was infused with religion, their promises absolute: justice, order, victory. To the weary and desperate, such certainty offered a strange comfort. To others, it was a harbinger of a new tyranny. The name Jabhat al-Nusra soon spread across Syria like a rumor too potent to ignore. An offshoot of al-Qaeda, Nusra presented itself not as an invader but as a champion of the oppressed. They handed out bread in towns where bakeries had been destroyed, repaired wells where water had run dry, and offered salaries to fighters who had grown disillusioned with the poorly funded FSA. Their tactics won them early support, not because their ideology was embraced, but because they filled voids left by both the collapsing state and the fractured opposition. For many Syrians, Nusra's presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they fought the regime with fierce determination, their ranks disciplined and their operations effective. They struck military convoys, overran checkpoints, and provided protection where none had existed. On the other hand, their rigid interpretation of faith imposed restrictions unfamiliar to many communities. In villages under their influence, women were pressured to cover more strictly, music was silenced, and the once colorful tapestry of Syrian life began to dull under their austere rule. The rise of Nusra revealed a tragic truth: revolutions do not exist in a vacuum. When people are left abandoned, when their cries go unanswered and their wounds fester, those who offer certainty, even in the form of extremism, find a foothold. What began as a revolution for dignity now risked being overtaken by ideologies alien to its origins. Meanwhile, the Free Syrian Army, once a symbol of hope, struggled under the weight of its limitations. Fragmented into countless brigades, lacking unified leadership, and starved of resources, the FSA found itself both resisting the regime and competing with groups like Nusra for influence. Fighters who once dreamed of protecting their neighborhoods grew disheartened as victories slipped away, not because of a lack of courage, but because of a lack of means. In this vacuum, extremism spread its wings. The cities bore witness to this shift in chilling ways. In Aleppo, as the battle dragged on, Nusra fighters appeared alongside FSA units, often outmaneuvering regime forces with brutal efficiency. Their victories earned them reluctant respect, but also deep unease. Civilians whispered, were these men liberators, or a new form of oppressors in disguise? In Homs, rumors circulated of new groups emerging, fighters not bound by national identity but by a transnational cause, whose loyalties extended far beyond Syria's borders. By the spring of 2013, the war had acquired a new complexion. The black flags of Nusra, and later of even darker forces, became as visible as the green, white, and black flags of the revolution. For the first time, the rebellion was no longer seen as solely a Syrian struggle for freedom but as a battlefield attracting the ambitions of ideologues and foreign fighters. This shift reverberated far beyond Syria's borders. Western governments, which had hesitated to fully back the opposition, now grew even more cautious. The presence of al-Qaeda affiliates made it easier to argue against providing heavy weapons or direct intervention. To many Syrians, this hesitation felt like betrayal. They had asked for support in their fight against tyranny, and in return, they received lectures about extremism while their towns were leveled. The irony cut deep. The world's reluctance to help had created the very vacuum that allowed extremism to grow. For civilians trapped in this storm, the choices narrowed to impossibility. Should they remain in their homes and endure bombardment, risking starvation or death? Should they flee, abandoning everything for the uncertain life of a refugee? Should they place their trust in the fractured rebels, the disciplined but unsettling extremists, or no one at all? Each option carried suffering, each path bled into tragedy. In refugee camps across Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, the rise of extremist groups became another layer of grief. Families who had fled Assad's brutality now feared their homeland slipping away into the hands of new oppressors. In Za'atari camp, men who once marched peacefully in protest spoke of their despair. We wanted freedom. Now there are flags we do not recognize, commands we do not understand. Is this the Syria we dreamed of? At the same time, the regime seized upon the rise of Nusra as proof of its long-standing claims. On television, Assad declared that his government was defending Syria from terrorism, casting himself as the guardian of stability in a world plagued by extremism. The narrative found receptive ears in some capitals, where policymakers prioritized the fear of jihadists over the cries of the Syrian people. What Syrians saw as their revolution was increasingly reframed in global discourse as a counterterrorism problem. The human cost of this transformation was staggering. In 2013, massacres multiplied, families slaughtered in villages accused of harboring rebels, entire communities starved under siege, children killed in bombardments. The violence grew not only in intensity but in cruelty. Barrel bombs continued to rain from the skies, crude yet devastating weapons that tore apart families and neighborhoods with chilling randomness. And then came the horrors that pierced even the most fatigued international conscience, the use of chemical weapons. In August 2013, the attack on Ghouta, near Damascus, unleashed sarin gas that suffocated hundreds of civilians in their sleep. The images that followed, rows of lifeless children, foam at their mouths, their bodies still and pale, shocked the world. For Syrians, it was confirmation of their deepest fears, that there were no limits to the weapons the regime would use, no boundaries to the suffering they might endure. Yet even this atrocity, which many thought might finally provoke decisive international intervention, resulted only in more negotiations, red lines blurred into invisibility, and fragile deals that failed to bring justice to the victims. Syrians learned again that their cries, however loud, were absorbed into the silence of geopolitics. Through all this, life inside Syria persisted in haunting fragments. In Aleppo, children played soccer amid ruins, their ball bouncing off collapsed walls. In Idlib, farmers tilled their fields under the shadow of distant gunfire. In Damascus, families gathered around radios to hear the latest news, their meals simple, their hearts heavy. Even as shadows lengthened across the land, the pulse of humanity refused to vanish. The rise of Nusra and other extremist factions did not extinguish the revolution's original spirit, but it obscured it, burying its chants beneath layers of war and ideology. The Syrian people's cry for dignity remained, but it was muffled by the roar of guns, the slogans of militants, and the apathy of the world. By the end of 2013, Syria was not only at war with itself but at war with the very idea of its identity. Was it still the land of poets and traders, of diverse faiths and communities? Or had it become merely another battlefield in a global struggle? The answer was unclear, lost amid smoke and silence. As the tale of how Syria's revolution, once luminous in its simplicity, was overshadowed by darker forces. It is a story of how despair breeds extremism, how abandonment creates monsters, and how the world's hesitation carved deeper wounds than bombs alone. The shadows had risen, and they were only beginning to spread. The city, once alive with the small ordinary rhythms of life, had now become a husk. Buildings stood like hollowed teeth in a decaying mouth, jagged, blackened, and unrecognizable from their former selves. The market stalls, where once the scent of spice and roasted nuts mingled in the air, now gave off the acrid bitterness of ash. Streets that once overflowed with chatter and footsteps had turned into arteries of silence, broken only by the occasional crack of sniper fire or the distant drone of aircraft circling above like vultures. This was what urban collapse looked like, when architecture became grave markers, when plazas turned into killing grounds, when every corner carried the possibility of an ending. Cities fall in different ways. Some are erased instantly, consumed by bombs or swallowed by firestorms. Others crumble slowly, losing not just walls but memory itself, until nothing remains but stories whispered by those who managed to crawl away. In Syria, cities died both ways. Aleppo, once a jewel of culture and commerce, found itself carved into two halves, one held by the regime, the other by the opposition, its people trapped in the merciless middle. Homs, once called the capital of the revolution, became a skeleton of its former self, its ancient avenues reduced to labyrinths of rubble. Idlib, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, names that once held promise of community and continuity, now synonymous with siege, hunger, and despair. Each city became a stage, and on these stages the actors were not kings or presidents but ordinary people, their survival elevated into acts of defiance. A mother boiling weeds for her children as siege closed around them. A father carving coffins out of doors and tables because wood was scarce but death was not. A child learning to identify the sound of different warplanes by ear, the knowledge of survival replacing the innocence of childhood. The collapse of a city is not only physical, it is psychological. Imagine hearing the constant whistle of incoming shells, never knowing if the next one is meant for you. Imagine the slow claustrophobia of siege, where food dwindles, medicine disappears, and time itself becomes an enemy. Imagine the unbearable burden of deciding whether to flee across sniper lines or to stay, risking both starvation and bombardment. In such conditions, even the fabric of trust begins to erode. Neighbors once bound together by community ties eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who might be an informer, who might betray them for a bag of flour or a moment of safety. Aleppo became the symbol of this unraveling. Once hailed as the commercial capital of Syria, its fall was not swift but agonizingly drawn out, a theater of suffering observed by the world in fragments of shaky phone footage uploaded at great risk. For years, it was divided, east and west, regime and opposition, civilian and fighter. But in truth, these divisions only told part of the story. Inside the bombed-out apartments and shattered mosques, people still tried to live, to love, to bury their dead with dignity. Yet each week, another market was destroyed, another hospital reduced to dust, another block of life torn apart. Hospitals, in particular, became symbols of both survival and destruction. International law had long declared them off-limits, sanctuaries in times of conflict. But in Syria, hospitals became targets, struck again and again until many were forced underground. Doctors worked in basements lit by dim generators, using equipment salvaged from ruins, performing amputations without anesthesia, sewing wounds with whatever thread could be found. To save lives became a crime punishable by death from above. And yet, they persisted, their hands shaking not from fear but from exhaustion. These doctors, nurses, and volunteers became the lifeline of cities in collapse, their bravery measured not in speeches but in hours of sleepless labor. The fall of cities is not measured only by bombs but by hunger. Siege warfare turned bustling neighborhoods into prisons. The roads were sealed, supplies cut off, and food vanished. In Homs, residents spoke of eating grass, leaves, and stray animals. In Madaya and eastern Ghouta, children wasted away before the eyes of their parents, their limbs thin as sticks, their eyes too large for their faces. Starvation became a weapon, slow, invisible, but devastating. And yet, even here, people resisted. Families pooled food, neighbors shared scraps, and stories spread of bakers making bread from weeds and ground seeds, anything to keep life going a little longer. And in these collapsing cities, another form of war thrived, propaganda. Both sides filmed and broadcast images, claiming victories, denying atrocities, shaping narratives for audiences far away. But for those inside, no narrative could capture the truth of daily terror. They lived in a world where truth was the smell of bodies beneath rubble, the sharp sting of chlorine in the air, the echo of explosions bouncing through empty hallways. The collapse of cities also collapsed time itself. Days blurred together in sameness, wake to the sound of shelling, search for water, scavenge for food, mourn the dead, and then try to sleep in the uneasy silence before it all began again. Children grew up without school, their memories of playgrounds replaced by bomb shelters. Weddings were held in the dark, ceremonies stripped to their essence, two hands joining, a promise whispered even as mortars fell outside. Funerals, when they could be held at all, were rushed affairs, sometimes carried out at night to avoid snipers, sometimes abandoned altogether when danger grew too great. Life became compressed, stripped down to the raw bones of existence. The eerie thing about cities in collapse is how they retain fragments of their old selves, like ghosts haunting the ruins. In Aleppo, fragments of ancient souks still stood amid the rubble, their arches scarred but not gone, as if defying the bombs. In Homs, the minarets of mosques jutted into the sky like broken fingers pointing to a heaven that seemed silent. In Damascus, even as neighborhoods crumbled, other quarters still glittered with lights and restaurants, a jarring juxtaposition that revealed how wars fracture reality itself. For those who managed to escape these collapsing cities, the memories followed them like shadows. Refugees spoke of nights spent hearing phantom shelling, of jumping at the sound of fireworks in foreign lands, of dreaming of streets they could no longer return to. They carried the city inside them, every ruined corner etched into memory. And though they lived, the collapse of their city lived with them, a wound without healing. The world watched these collapses through screens, fragments of horror filtered through social media and occasional news broadcasts. The images came, a child covered in dust and blood, sitting silently in an ambulance, a man cradling the lifeless body of his twin infants after a gas attack, crowds of civilians evacuating through corridors lined with rubble. The world watched, shook its head, and then turned to other distractions. For those inside, the collapse continued long after the headlines moved on. There is something uncanny about the silence of a collapsed city. At night, after the shelling pauses, the absence of sound becomes deafening. No laughter, no footsteps, no vendors calling out in markets. Only the distant echo of dogs scavenging among ruins, the rustle of wind through shattered windows, the faint dripping of water from a broken pipe. It is in this silence that the true weight of collapse is felt, not in the chaos of bombardment, but in the emptiness left behind. And yet, within this silence, voices still rose. Mothers told stories to calm their children, even when there was no light to see their faces. Men recited poetry as bombs fell, words carrying defiance into the dark. Children played games amid rubble, their laughter brief but real, proof that even in collapse, life clawed its way forward. These small fragments of resilience became the threads holding the city together, even as walls crumbled and streets bled. Cities do not die all at once, they wither, they resist, they collapse piece by piece. In Syria, their collapse became a mirror for the collapse of humanity itself. Each ruined block, each starving child, each broken hospital asked the same silent question: how much suffering can the world overlook before it admits its own complicity? The answer, it seems, is vast. The cities fell, and the world watched, and in the ruins, people whispered to themselves the only prayer they had left, that tomorrow, perhaps, they might still be alive. There is no cruelty sharper, no wound deeper, than war inflicted upon a child. The Syrian Civil War, like a monstrous tide, swept away childhoods as if they were fragile sandcastles on the shore. For in the logic of war, there is no room for laughter in playgrounds, no patience for the scribbles of crayons, no space for the sound of children chasing each other in the streets. Instead, the streets became battlegrounds, playgrounds became graveyards, and the children of Syria grew up with the weight of shadows pressing down on their shoulders. Their lullabies were the howl of jet engines, their toys fragments of unexploded shells, their bedtime stories tales of fleeing and hiding, of neighbors lost, of fathers who did not come home. Childhood, in its most natural form, is supposed to be a fragile chrysalis where innocence is protected, nurtured, and allowed to bloom. But in Syria, that chrysalis was shattered, exposing children to winds too cold and fires too hot. The war did not simply end childhood, it reshaped it, forcing children to step into roles no child should bear: breadwinners, caregivers, soldiers, mourners. Their laughter, when it surfaced at all, sounded strangely out of place against the backdrop of sirens and collapsing walls, a fragile defiance against a world that no longer protected them. Imagine a child in Aleppo, once attending school with a backpack filled with books and pencils. Now, that same child drags a plastic bag filled with scraps of bread scavenged from debris. Their hands, once practicing letters on a school desk, now blackened by ash as they pick through ruins for something, anything, that might be useful. Another child in Homs carries their younger sibling on their back, the two of them moving together like one body, one struggling heart. The elder child has not yet reached 10, yet their eyes already reflect the hollow gaze of someone who has seen too much, endured too much, lost too much. The war taught children to recognize sounds the way other children learn words. The thrum of helicopters became distinct from the sharper roar of fighter jets. The whistle of incoming shells became a grim countdown clock in their heads, teaching them when to duck, when to run, when to hold still. In another life, these children might have learned to recognize bird songs or the different tones of a school bell. But war had other lessons, darker ones, replacing innocence with survival instincts. Many children lost their schools altogether. Buildings once filled with chalkboards, lessons, and laughter became shelters for displaced families, or worse, targets of bombings. Education, the very bridge to a future, collapsed beneath the rubble of war. In its place, the classroom became the streets, where survival replaced arithmetic, hunger replaced history, and fear replaced science. Teachers, when they survived, did their best to gather small groups, writing lessons in the dirt or on scraps of paper, clinging to the belief that knowledge might still keep the flame of hope alive. But for many children, the only lessons left were those taught by the sharp hand of war. The loss of play may seem trivial when measured against bombs and starvation, yet play is the language of childhood. Its absence reveals a deeper wound. A child without play is a child denied imagination, denied the ability to create a world beyond the horrors they endure. And yet, even here, children found fragments of play. A deflated soccer ball kicked among ruins, its surface scarred but still rolling. Games of hide-and-seek played in collapsed houses, laughter echoing between broken walls, momentarily drowning out the terror outside. Even the act of drawing, with coal on rubble, with sticks in dust, became a way to escape, if only for a fleeting second. But the drawings themselves betrayed the depth of their suffering. Aid workers who collected the sketches of Syrian children found scenes not of flowers and suns but of tanks, helicopters, and corpses. Crayon-colored explosions filled their pages, red smeared across skies, stick figures lying beneath rubble. The psyche of war etched itself into these drawings, a silent testimony to horrors they could not yet articulate in words. These drawings, preserved by those who cared, became haunting artifacts of a stolen generation. The war also conscripted children in ways both visible and hidden. Some were pulled into armed groups, carrying rifles too heavy for their small bodies, taught to fight and kill before they had even learned multiplication. Others were pressed into roles as messengers, smugglers, or lookouts, their small size making them ideal tools for warlords and commanders. Even those not directly enlisted bore the weight of war in their families. Children became breadwinners, working in markets or collecting scrap metal to keep their siblings alive. The burden of survival fell upon shoulders far too young to carry it. Starvation, too, carved its mark most cruelly into children. Their bodies, fragile and still growing, could not endure the long months of sieges without adequate food. The images that emerged, children with limbs like sticks, bellies distended, eyes sunken yet hauntingly large, shocked even the most hardened observers. Yet, for many Syrians, such sights became tragically familiar. Parents would starve themselves so their children might have an extra spoon of soup, a single crust of bread. Still, many children did not survive, their names whispered in the dark as families buried them quickly to avoid shelling. The collapse of healthcare hit children hardest. Vaccinations stopped, leading to the resurgence of diseases long thought eradicated. Polio crept back into Syria, disabling children who might have otherwise run freely in fields. Malnutrition left others stunted, their growth permanently scarred by hunger. Hospitals, when they could be reached, were overwhelmed, with too few doctors, too little medicine, and too many patients. Parents carried their sick children through bombed streets, praying for miracles, often finding only closed doors or rubble where hospitals once stood. And yet, amid this darkness, children displayed a resilience that defied comprehension. Their capacity to laugh, even in the face of devastation, baffled adults who had long since forgotten joy. Their ability to play with scraps, to sing songs in shelters, to imagine worlds beyond rubble, became a fragile light in the abyss. Aid workers often spoke of being stunned by the strength of these children, the way a smile could emerge despite hunger, the way they clung to life with small but unyielding hands. The war reshaped families as well. Many children were orphaned, forced to navigate a world without the guidance of parents. Some found themselves caring for younger siblings, playing roles of father and mother long before their time. Others were absorbed into makeshift families in refugee camps, clinging to distant relatives or strangers who offered some semblance of stability. In these fractured arrangements, bonds formed quickly, as survival demanded closeness, demanded trust. Childhood, however, was gone, replaced by a relentless maturity born of loss. For children who fled Syria, exile came with its own trauma. Camps in neighboring countries offered safety from bombs but not from deprivation. Life intense, the endless waiting for aid, the gnawing hunger, all of it carved deep scars. Many children grew up in these camps, never knowing the homes their parents once had. Their sense of identity shifted, becoming children of nowhere, their roots torn, their futures uncertain. Some found places in foreign schools, learning new languages, trying to adapt to cultures that often viewed them with suspicion or pity. Others fell into the cracks, denied education, their futures dimmed before they could begin. Perhaps the most haunting thing about the children of Syria is how they became symbols. Photographs of them circulated across the world, shocking viewers, igniting brief waves of outrage. The image of a boy washed ashore on a Turkish beach became an emblem of the refugee crisis. Another boy, sitting silently in an ambulance, his face covered in dust and blood, became a symbol of Aleppo's suffering. These images pierced global consciousness for a moment, but symbols fade, and attention shifts. The children remained, their suffering unrelenting, even as the world moved on. In Syria, the war devoured not only the present but the future, and children are the embodiment of that future. To wound them is to wound tomorrow itself. And yet, even amid this tragedy, a strange resilience persists. Syrian children, despite the horrors, continue to dream. They dream of becoming doctors, teachers, singers, even as bombs fall around them. They dream of going back to school, of playing soccer in safe fields, of sleeping without fear. Their dreams, fragile as they may be, carry the faint possibility that Syria's future might not be entirely lost. But dreams alone cannot erase scars. The trauma carried by these children will linger long after the war fades from headlines. Nightmares will follow them, anxieties will grip them, and memories will haunt them. Their generation is one marked forever, shaped by fire and rubble, by hunger and loss. The children of Syria are not only victims, they are witnesses, carriers of memory, bearers of a truth the world would rather overlook. And in their eyes, the world might still see what it has tried so hard to ignore, the devastating human cost of indifference. There are moments when the suffering of Syrian children seem to break through the fog of global indifference. For a brief instant, the world's attention turned toward them. A photograph of a boy named Alan Kurdi, his small body washed ashore on a Turkish beach in 2015, pierced hearts across the globe. He had fled with his family, their fragile boat capsizing before reaching safety. In that haunting image, the fragility of childhood confronted the enormity of conflict. People wept, protests surged, pledges were made. Yet weeks later, attention waned, and the endless tide of suffering returned to invisibility. Alan became a symbol, and then a memory. But in Syria and its refugee camps, thousands of other Alans lived and died without the world ever knowing their names. The cruelty of war upon children was not only in its violence but in its banality. Hunger is quiet. Disease creeps in without spectacle. Trauma hides behind eyes that still manage to smile. For every child pulled from rubble in front of cameras, thousands more languished unseen, struggling in tents, wasting away in besieged towns, wandering among ruins in search of family. Their suffering, too vast to be captured in single images, became background noise to a world already saturated with tragedy. In eastern Ghouta, aid convoys documented children fainting from malnutrition. Their small bodies trembled from hunger, skin stretched too tightly across fragile bones. Mothers pressed boiled leaves into their mouths to silence cries they could not satisfy. In Madaya, children whispered of eating salt water soup, of sucking on stones to trick their stomachs into stillness. In Aleppo, during the long years of siege, children's bellies ached so constantly that hunger itself became a normal state of being. Childhood, instead of being defined by growth and curiosity, became a daily negotiation with pain. Yet children are resilient in ways that confound adults. Amid the hunger, amid the terror, there was still play, muted, distorted, but play nonetheless. In the shattered skeleton of Homs, boys made a game of running across sniper alleys, timing their dashes with the crack of distant gunfire. Girls in Idlib tied ribbons around their wrists, pretending to dance while their mothers fetched water from dangerous wells. In refugee camps, children gathered stones to set up imaginary kitchens, cooking meals that existed only in their imaginations. This play was not frivolous, it was survival. It allowed them, for a few moments, to inhabit a world where choice and safety still existed. The sound of children's laughter in war is uncanny. It rings louder than in peace, because it is surrounded by silence and death. Aid workers often spoke of the surreal contrast between children's voices and the destruction around them. A child would giggle while climbing a ruined wall, the same wall where neighbors had been buried days before. Another would sing songs taught by her grandmother, her small voice rising above the buzz of drones circling in the distance. Laughter in war is defiance. It is the refusal to let despair claim every corner of existence. But not all children had the chance to laugh. Many were pressed into the machinery of war. Militias and extremist groups, aware of the desperation of families, recruited boys as fighters. Some joined willingly, lured by promises of food, protection, or a sense of belonging. Others were coerced, threatened, or kidnapped. They carried rifles taller than themselves, their shoulders straining beneath the weight of weapons. They manned checkpoints, patrolled ruined neighborhoods, even participated in battles. Childhood, in these cases, was not just stolen, it was weaponized. Girls, too, bore heavy burdens. Some were forced into early marriages, their families seeing no other way to ensure their survival. Others took on the role of surrogate mothers, raising younger siblings when parents were killed or disappeared. Some were subjected to unspeakable violence, their innocence violated in ways too painful to articulate. And yet, many of these girls endured, their strength quiet but profound, their survival itself an act of resistance against the destruction around them. Schools, when they existed, became sanctuaries under siege. In some neighborhoods, basements doubled as classrooms, dimly lit by candles or weak generators. Teachers scribbled lessons on broken boards, children writing in battered notebooks that had survived bombardments. The thirst for learning persisted, even as shells fell nearby. Parents risked sending their children to these makeshift schools, believing that education might still open a path out of despair. But these schools, too, were targets. Bombings killed children in their classrooms, scattering textbooks across blood-stained floors. Education became an act of courage, one that carried the risk of death. Trauma etched itself deeply into the minds of Syria's children. Nightmares haunted their sleep. Many woke screaming, hearing phantom shelling, feeling imaginary rubble falling onto their small bodies. Others became silent, withdrawing into themselves, their voices muted by fear. Psychologists working in camps described children reenacting war in their play, building checkpoints out of sticks, pretending to fire guns, staging rescues of dolls from collapsed piles of dirt. War became their framework for understanding the world, their only language of imagination. And yet, despite trauma, many carried hope like a stubborn ember. When asked what they wanted to be, children spoke of becoming doctors, engineers, teachers, even pilots, not of warplanes, but of planes that carried people safely across skies. Their dreams, fragile as they seemed, were not naive. They were acts of survival, declarations that war could not entirely erase their vision of tomorrow. A child who dreams of being a doctor in the midst of famine and disease is making a statement louder than any weapon, that life, despite everything, must continue. In exile, Syrian children encountered a different kind of war, the slow erosion of identity. Camps in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan became cities of children, their numbers swelling year after year. Some were born there, never seeing Syria, yet carrying its name as a shadow. They grew up stateless, their sense of belonging fractured. Language, too, became a battlefield. Some children lost Arabic, learning Turkish or German or English instead. Others clung fiercely to their mother tongue, fearing that to lose it was to lose Syria itself. Between these tensions, children of exile lived in limbo, their identities suspended, their futures uncertain. The world sometimes claimed to care. International agencies issued reports, NGOs organized campaigns, governments pledged aid. But the children of Syria quickly learned that promises often meant little. Food distributions were irregular, education programs underfunded, medical care limited. Some children waited years for resettlement, watching their youth drain away in camps of mud and dust. Others slipped into labor, exploited in factories and fields, their childhood exchanged for meager wages. Childhood, in exile, was still denied, just in different forms. There were moments of light, however, scattered like stars across a night sky. Volunteers teaching art classes to children in tents, encouraging them to paint not only war but dreams. Doctors setting up mobile clinics, ensuring vaccinations reached small arms. Communities abroad opening schools, welcoming refugee children into classrooms alongside their own. These acts did not erase the vast suffering, but they mattered. They reminded the children that the world was not entirely indifferent, that kindness could still pierce through the cruelty of war. But time is relentless, and the Syrian war has stretched on for years, longer than the childhood of many who lived through it. Some children who once played in ruins are now adults, carrying their traumas into new lives. Others, who were born during the war, know no other reality. For them, Syria is not a place of memory but of myth, described by parents and grandparents who recall streets, gardens, and homes that no longer exist. Their Syria lives only in stories, while their own lives unfold in exile or in the ruins of what remains. The haunting truth is that an entire generation has been marked. This generation of Syrian children has grown up in an environment that normalizes violence, deprivation, and loss. Their scars, visible and invisible, will shape the future of the nation, whether in rebuilding or in carrying pain forward. Childhood, once thought of as a protected space, has in Syria become another battlefield, one that may take decades to heal. The silence of the world deepens this wound. For while bombs may fall in Syria, their echoes reach beyond borders. To ignore the children of Syria is to accept a world where innocence can be destroyed without consequence, where the most vulnerable can suffer without protection. And if the world can overlook Syrian children, what does that say about its future, about its own sense of humanity? Children are mirrors of society. Their laughter, their health, their safety, reflect the condition of the world itself. In Syria, those mirrors were shattered, and what stared back was not just the suffering of a nation but the failure of humanity as a whole. Each hungry child, each orphaned sibling, each body buried too soon, these are not only Syrian tragedies. They are human tragedies, indictments of a world that looked away. And yet, even in this indictment, there is a fragile hope. Children, though wounded, remain resilient. Their capacity for joy, their insistence on dreaming, their ability to cling to fragments of humanity even when everything else has been stripped away, all of this suggests that the story of Syria's children is not solely one of despair. They are also the carriers of possibility. If given the chance, if nurtured and supported, they may yet rebuild what was lost, carrying forward not only scars but also strength. In their eyes, there lingers a message, a plea, a demand, that the world must not overlook them. That their suffering matters. That their dreams matter. That their future, fragile and uncertain, is still worth protecting. The war in Syria was not only a struggle over territory, ideology, and survival, it was also a relentless force that displaced millions from the fragile soil that had once carried the weight of their ancestors. By the midpoint of the conflict, entire cities stood half-empty, their populations scattered across borders, fields, camps, and seas. The phenomenon of displacement was both physical and spiritual, bodies uprooted, and souls suspended in the liminal state between belonging and estrangement. For Syria, displacement became its shadow, stretching across continents, cast into every corner of the world where Syrians sought refuge. When the shells fell and the airstrikes came, families fled in haste. Some took the narrow, dangerous roads toward neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. Others risked the unforgiving Mediterranean, where the sea demanded a toll of lives, pulling down boats heavy with desperation. The image of small children washed ashore would pierce the conscience of the world for a fleeting moment, but then recede into silence. Yet beyond the headline tragedies, there were millions more stories, quiet, unseen, forgotten, about exile that reshaped the very fabric of Syrian identity. The refugee camps became landscapes of suspended time. Rows upon rows of tents or prefabricated shelters lined dusty plains, guarded by barbed wire and watchtowers. For those inside, time no longer advanced in the ordinary rhythm. Days were marked by aid distributions, water deliveries, or the long lines at medical tents. Birthdays, weddings, funerals, all of life's milestones became muted, held in the in-between space of displacement. Children grew taller between tent walls, their memories of Syria fading into the echoes of their parents' stories. For the older generations, exile felt like an open wound, an endless longing for the streets, courtyards, and mosques of their hometowns. The psychological weight of exile was heavier than the physical act of fleeing. Uprooted, Syrians often felt suspended, caught between a past they could no longer return to and a future uncertain in lands that did not fully embrace them. Displacement fractured families. Some were scattered across multiple countries, communicating through smuggled phones, letters, or brief moments of internet connectivity in camp community centers. Others lost contact entirely, leaving loved ones to wonder for years whether a sibling, parent, or child still lived somewhere beyond the horizon. The act of exile was not just escape, it was transformation. Those who left behind their villages and neighborhoods carried fragments of Syria with them, recipes, lullabies, photographs, dialects. In exile, these fragments became both lifelines and burdens. They reminded Syrians of what was lost, but also stitched fragile threads of continuity across foreign lands. In Europe, Syrian bakeries opened in small towns, their smells carrying memories of Damascus streets. In Canada and the United States, Syrians built new communities while still whispering prayers in Arabic for their return. Yet displacement was not equal. The wealthy or well-connected often found refuge in safer havens, obtaining visas or asylum in distant nations. The poor and marginalized, however, were left to navigate perilous journeys across deserts, rivers, and seas. Smugglers became both saviors and predators, charging exorbitant fees for passage that often led to tragedy. Many never made it past the Mediterranean, their names unrecorded, their graves the endless waves. Exile became not just a test of endurance but of chance, who lived, who drowned, who found shelter, who was turned away. Inside Syria, displacement took another form, the internally displaced persons, IDPs. Families fled from bombed neighborhoods to safer ones, only to be uprooted again when the front lines shifted. School gyms, unfinished buildings, and makeshift shelters became temporary homes. In these transient spaces, families crowded together, privacy evaporated, and dignity was constantly tested. Children scribbled lessons on scraps of paper, trying to continue their education amid chaos. Mothers improvised kitchens from firewood and salvaged pots, their meals both survival and an act of defiance against despair. Exile carried with it an echo of betrayal. Many Syrians felt abandoned by the international community, whose fleeting moments of sympathy often dissolved into political stalemates. Promises of resettlement were made but not kept, and humanitarian aid was frequently insufficient or diverted. For refugees, the journey across borders was not just a geographical movement, it was a confrontation with indifference, bureaucracy, and hostility. Nations argued over quotas while families languished in limbo. The haunting truth was that displacement reshaped the Syrian psyche as much as the war itself. Exile meant relearning how to exist, how to reconstruct identity without the anchoring force of homeland. A farmer who once tilled fertile soil outside Aleppo now worked in a factory in Germany. A teacher who had guided generations of students in Homs now struggled to learn the language of a foreign land just to survive. A grandmother who once hosted extended family under her courtyard's grapevines now sat alone in a camp, clutching the key to a house that no longer stood. The stories of displacement unfolded with a quiet eeriness. To walk through a refugee camp at night was to witness thousands of muted laments carried on the wind, the coughing of children, the murmured prayers of parents, the distant crying of newborns, the low hum of generators cutting through silence. Shadows stretched across tent walls as if recording the restless movement of a people unable to sleep peacefully. Each tent was a story, a suspended dream, a reminder that exile is both survival and loss. Syria's tragedy, exile became more than physical absence, it became an enduring metaphor for disconnection, a people severed from their land, traditions, and even from themselves. Exile was a state of being where the soul wandered even when the body found temporary shelter. And as the years dragged on, exile became not temporary displacement but a new, haunting permanence, an identity that generations would carry forward, long after the smoke of war faded. Exile, once imagined as temporary, hardened with time into permanence. What began as flight for safety slowly calcified into a long-term reality that few could undo. By the 5th year of the conflict, many Syrians began to realize that the return they had clung to as a certainty was slipping further into impossibility. Each passing year made the home they remembered feel less like a place and more like a dream, elusive and half-lit, hovering at the edges of memory. Their houses still existed in thought, their neighborhoods replayed in conversations, but physically, they were often gone, reduced to rubble, seized by militias, or rebuilt by others. The dream of return, once fierce, transformed into a ghost that both comforted and haunted the displaced. Generational divides in exile deepened the tragedy. Children born in camps or in foreign lands grew up with fractured identities. They learned Turkish, German, or English faster than they picked up the Arabic their parents insisted on preserving. Their lullabies sometimes came in 2 languages, their prayers sometimes in 3. For them, Syria was an abstract inheritance, described in bedtime stories or shown in fading photographs. Parents insisted, "You are Syrian." Never forget, yet the children's daily lives belonged elsewhere. Their sense of homeland was rooted less in direct memory than in fragments, recipes their mothers cooked, words their fathers insisted they repeat, or rituals preserved in exile. For older Syrians, this generational drift was painful. They worried that Syria itself, as they had known it, was dissolving in the hands of children who would grow up strangers to its soil. The elderly, meanwhile, carried exile most heavily. Displacement at the end of life is a cruel irony, leaving behind the graves of one's ancestors and knowing one's own bones may rest in foreign earth. Many older Syrians whispered regrets into the night, that they had not stayed, that they had not fought, or that they had survived while their homes had been destroyed. They clutched keys, land deeds, or small jars of soil carried from their gardens, as though these objects were magical talismans that could one day unlock a return. But the years passed, and those keys opened nothing but memory, and the soil remained trapped in glass, unable to sprout. The camps themselves became strange cities of exile. They had economies, hierarchies, schools, and markets. Children played soccer in alleys of dust. Men improvised shops, selling cigarettes, phone chargers, or second-hand clothes. Women traded recipes, stitched clothing, and shared whispered news of relatives scattered across the globe. Yet under this thin layer of activity, there was a profound stillness, an awareness that these were not cities meant to endure. They were temporary, yet their temporariness lasted years. A tent pitched in desperation became a structure where entire childhoods unfolded. A container meant as shelter became a home for a decade. This eerie permanence gave the camps a dreamlike quality, places that existed, but were not meant to exist forever, holding lives that could neither move forward nor return backward. Displacement also reshaped memory itself. Syrians who fled Aleppo, Homs, or Raqqa remembered their cities not as they were, but as they wished to preserve them. Memory became a reconstruction project, a selective preservation. Streets seemed wider in recollection, skies bluer, nights safer. Nostalgia merged with longing, and soon the Syria carried in exile was not exactly the Syria that once stood, but a Syria imagined, an ideal homeland uncorrupted by war, violence, or loss. This imagined homeland was a balm against despair, but it also deepened the pain, for each reminder of reality exposed the gap between memory and the ruined truth. And then there was the sea, the merciless, shimmering threshold that many Syrians crossed and many did not. The Mediterranean became a cemetery without markers. Families piled into inflatable boats, praying that the night would cover their passage, that the horizon would bring safety. Some reached Greek shores, soaked and trembling. Others capsized, swallowed by waters that did not care for politics, borders, or prayers. The world's attention flickered briefly when images of drowned children surfaced in newspapers, but soon the seas continued their silent harvest, and the exodus carried on. For Syrians, the sea came to symbolize both possibility and annihilation, a path to refuge or a grave in the deep. Beyond the seas and borders, in cities far from Syria, exile acquired another layer, invisibility. In Berlin, in Paris, in Toronto, Syrians built new lives, but they were often ghosts within the societies they entered. Their accents marked them as outsiders. Their stories, too heavy for casual conversation, remained untold. They worked long hours, sent money back to relatives, tried to blend into societies that welcomed them with conditions. Exile here was not marked by barbed wire but by the quiet weight of being forever in between, belonging neither fully to the host country nor entirely to the homeland left behind. For those who could not leave, displacement remained internal, and this too had its own haunting quality. Families relocated again and again within Syria, shifting from one ruined city to another. Each move left behind possessions, neighbors, routines. A sense of impermanence clung to every place, like a faint shadow trailing each family. Even when they unpacked their bags in a new shelter, they did so with the quiet knowledge that they would likely have to leave again. This endless repetition hollowed out hope. Life became a cycle of packing, fleeing, and waiting. The identity of exile began to weave itself into art, literature, and song. Syrian poets in Lebanon wrote verses of longing, their words soaked with homesickness and fury. Painters in Europe painted doorways and courtyards, familiar scenes from neighborhoods that no longer stood. Musicians played oud melodies in foreign cafes, their music both a comfort and a reminder of distance. Exile created a culture of mourning and remembrance, but also a culture of resilience, expressions that insisted Syria lived on, even if scattered across the world. But exile also brought conflict within the displaced communities themselves. In camps, tensions arose between families from different towns, sects, or political leanings. Host countries sometimes inflamed these divisions, distributing aid unevenly or favoring certain groups. Resentments grew, and the fractures of the war carried into exile, magnifying the sense of alienation. The exiled carried not only the grief of loss but the weight of unresolved rivalries and grievances, transplanted into foreign soil. As the years dragged on, the haunting truth emerged: exile was not a pause in history but a new chapter entirely. Children raised outside Syria would one day become adults who might never return. Their sense of belonging would be layered, hybrid, ambiguous. The homeland would remain a story told by parents and grandparents, perhaps visited in fragments, but never fully lived. Exile thus became intergenerational, binding not only those who fled but their descendants as well. It reshaped the Syrian identity into something global, scattered, and profoundly marked by loss. To walk through the streets of exile communities in distant cities was to hear echoes of Syria in accents, in aromas of food, in prayers. But these echoes never harmonized into wholeness. They remained fragments, haunting reminders of a place that continued to exist only partially. Syrians in exile became both witnesses and wanderers, carrying their homeland in memory while trying to root themselves elsewhere. And so exile became the final paradox of the Syrian Civil War. The war itself ravaged cities, destroyed lives, and shattered communities. But exile ensured that even beyond the war's front lines, Syrians would continue to feel its shadows. Displacement spread the tragedy across borders, transforming it into a global phenomenon. No matter where Syrians went, they carried the weight of absence, the silence of homes they could not return to, the lingering question of identity. In the quiet hours of night, whether in a tent on the border, an apartment in Istanbul, or a small house in Europe, the exiled whispered the same words: "One day, we will go home." Yet even as they said it, they knew that home had become a shifting ghost, present in memory, absent in reality. Syria, in exile, lived on as both wound and dream. Exile was not just a consequence of war, it was the war's most enduring shadow. And in that shadow, Syrians wandered, haunted by what was lost, sustained by what they carried, and forever marked by the silent tragedy of displacement. The war in Syria did not end with a declaration, nor with the signing of treaties beneath the gilded ceilings of distant halls. It did not close with victory parades, nor with the solemn lowering of flags. It faded instead into a long twilight, where violence became intermittent rather than constant, where fear shifted from sudden explosions to the grinding weight of poverty, where the ruins remained and the ghosts did not leave. Wars end on paper, they seldom end in the hearts of those who have lived them. And so, for Syria, what the world might call an end was only another chapter in an unfinished book. The epilogue of this tragedy is not peace, but silence. Not the gentle silence of calm after storm, but a silence heavy with memory, filled with echoes that refuse to dissipate. In the streets of Damascus, one hears it between the hum of generators and the murmurs of crowded markets. In the ruins of Aleppo, one feels it pressing against the stones, as though the walls themselves remember. In refugee camps that stretch across deserts, silence falls at night when children finally drift into uneasy sleep, and parents stare into the dark, carrying memories too heavy to voice. It is this silence, the silence of survival, of unspoken grief, of unburied memory, that forms the truest closing note of the Syrian war. The silence is not empty, it is thick, vibrating, haunted. It holds stories that were never told, names never recorded, tears never seen. It is a silence the world has largely ignored, too eager to move on, too uncomfortable to listen. But for Syrians, it is inescapable, following them through streets, across borders, into exile and into dreams. To walk through post-war Syria is to encounter layers of silence stitched into the land itself. The silence of abandoned villages, where grass has overtaken collapsed roofs and stray dogs wander through what were once courtyards filled with children's laughter. The silence of bombed hospitals, their corridors littered with rusting equipment, beds overturned, walls scarred with soot. The silence of graveyards, some formal, others improvised, where rows of stones bear names scratched hastily by grieving hands, and others remain unmarked, holding the nameless dead. Even in places where life continues, silence lingers as an invisible presence. Markets bustle with buyers and sellers, but conversations often end abruptly, cut short by an unspoken fear of speaking too freely. Schools resume lessons, but teachers hesitate to address the gaps in children's knowledge, the years lost to siege and displacement. Families gather for meals, but at every table there are empty chairs, spaces where memory sits in place of the dead or the exiled. This silence is the thread that runs through everything, a fragile binding that holds together a society too fractured to be mended quickly. And yet, silence does not mean absence. Beneath it lies endurance, and within endurance lies a strange form of resistance. Syrians have learned to live with silence, to carve meaning into it, to weave it into the rhythm of survival. They may not always speak their grief aloud, but they carry it forward in rituals both small and profound, in the lighting of a candle for the missing, in the quiet tending of a grave, in the passing down of stories to children who have never seen the land their parents describe. Silence, though heavy, has become a vessel of memory. The epilogue of the Syrian Civil War is also written in exile, across continents and languages. In Europe, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Canada, and beyond, Syrian families navigate the delicate balance of belonging and longing. Their lives are marked by duality, the need to adapt to new societies while holding on to the fragments of their homeland. Children born abroad grow up speaking new tongues, their parents' language softened by foreign accents. They learn history from books in classrooms, but the history of their family, of Syria, is whispered at night, wrapped in lullabies and old photographs. Exile carries its own silences. The silence of not being fully understood, of being seen as refugees before being seen as people. The silence of watching one's homeland vanish from headlines, knowing that the world has turned its gaze elsewhere. The silence of waiting for return, for justice, for closure that may never come. And yet, exile also carries resilience. In the kitchens of Berlin, baklava is baked as it once was in Homs. In Istanbul, oud strings vibrate with the same songs once sung in Aleppo. In the neighborhoods of Amman, Arabic calligraphy adorns walls, reminding the displaced of a culture that refuses to fade. Exile does not erase identity, it reshapes it, scattering it across the world like seeds. These seeds take root in unexpected ways. Syrian literature blooms in languages far from Arabic, Syrian art fills galleries abroad, Syrian voices speak in parliaments and universities thousands of miles from the Euphrates. The tragedy of displacement becomes, in some corners, a story of persistence, of carrying memory into new futures. Yet even in these triumphs, the longing remains, the longing for home, for return, for the streets and skies that memory refuses to release. The war's epilogue is also written in the lives of children who know nothing but its shadow. A boy born in a besieged neighborhood grows into adolescence surrounded by ruins, his childhood games shaped by the remnants of violence. A girl raised in a refugee camp dreams of becoming a doctor, her ambition forged by the absence of clinics and the memory of sickness untreated. For these children, the war is not history but inheritance. They carry forward the weight of a conflict they did not choose, and yet, in their laughter, in their learning, in their survival, lies the possibility of renewal. Generations yet unborn will live in the echo of this war, just as Syrians today still feel the aftershocks of invasions centuries past. Memory flows like a river through bloodlines, carrying fragments of stories, shaping identities. What Syria becomes in the decades ahead will depend not only on reconstruction of buildings, but on the reconstruction of trust, of education, of community. It will depend on whether silence becomes a tomb or a seedbed. The world, in its haste, prefers closure. It prefers to mark wars as finished, to tally casualties and move on. But Syria resists such closure. Its war has seeped too deeply into the soil, into the bones of its people, into the consciousness of a generation. To speak of it in the past tense is to deny the persistence of its effects, the reality of its endurance. The epilogue, then, is not an ending but a haunting. It is a reminder that wars do not end when the guns fall silent, but when the wounds of memory have healed, and in Syria, those wounds remain raw. Perhaps that is the lesson for the world, that to overlook Syria is to overlook not only the suffering of a nation, but the truth of war itself. Every conflict leaves behind ghosts, silences, absences. To turn away is to consign those ghosts to wander unheard. To listen, however uncomfortably, is to grant dignity to the survivors, to acknowledge that their silence is not emptiness but testimony. And so, the Syrian Civil War closes not with finality, but with whispers. Whispers carried in the wind over broken cities. Whispers told in the kitchens of exile, in lullabies and prayers. Whispers rising from graves unmarked, from ruins untended, from children who dream of futures their parents could not secure. Whispers that say, "We are still here. We endure. Do not forget us." The world may look away, but Syria remains, etched into the silence, insistent in memory, alive in endurance. And as long as these whispers continue, the story is not over. The story of No Gun Re, by the dawn of the 21st century, had grown into something both sharp and spectral. Sharp in the sense that it cut against the easy narratives of wartime heroism that had long been propagated, spectral in that it floated across borders and generations, never quite visible to the wider world, yet never entirely gone. For decades, silence was its strongest weapon. Silence from governments, silence from the military, silence even from survivors who could not bear to speak of what they had witnessed. But silence, though oppressive, is fragile. Over time, it cracks. Whispers become questions, questions become testimonies, and testimonies, when gathered carefully, become history. By the 1990s, when a team of journalists unearthed the fragments of this buried truth, the world had changed. The Cold War was over, South Korea was no longer a dictatorship, and the American military presence in Asia had become less about existential defense and more about the delicate choreography of diplomacy. Into this shifting atmosphere, the voices of No Gun Re survivors broke through. Old men and women, their bodies frail but their memories piercing, recounted the days of terror under the bridge. Their testimonies were not dramatic, they were deliberate. They spoke of children clutching their mothers, of hunger and thirst as they hid, of the unending rattle of machine guns, of the confusion of being trapped between armies. Their words were not polished for the camera. They stumbled, they hesitated, sometimes their stories contradicted one another in detail. But in their essence, they aligned. Something monstrous had happened, and the weight of it could no longer be ignored. Journalists carried these voices into print. Documents began to surface, orders, memos, reports. Each page bore the faint scent of smoke and blood, echoes of decisions made hastily in fear. Each file was another crack in the silence. And yet, history does not yield easily. Governments resisted. The U.S. military, when confronted, spoke cautiously. At first, there was denial, claims that such killings could not have taken place, or that they were the tragic but unintended result of battlefield confusion. Later, As evidence deepened, language softened, regrettable incidents, miscommunications, fog of war. Such phrases, designed to obscure, could not blunt the sharpness of survivors' memories. Still, there were moments of reckoning. In 2001, the U.S. government issued an official statement of regret, an acknowledgement that civilians had been killed at No Gun Re, though still couched in terms that avoided full admission of responsibility. Compensation was minimal, symbolic rather than restorative. For the survivors, it was something, but not enough. They had not merely wanted acknowledgement, they had wanted truth, the kind of truth that could breathe openly, without euphemism. Instead, what they received was an uneasy compromise, an apology that seemed half-forced, filtered through legal and political caution. Yet even that half-apology mattered. For the elderly survivors who had carried their memories like burning coals in the dark, it meant that the world had at least glanced in their direction. That their suffering was no longer a phantom only they could see. For historians, the No Gun Re case became a touchstone, a reminder of the shadows that linger at the edges of official narratives. For students, it became a story whispered in classrooms, often contested, sometimes denied, but always returning. History has a way of echoing across landscapes. In the small village near the bridge, life carried on, but with a hollow note. Children grew up playing near the same railway tracks where their grandparents once lay trembling. The bridge itself stood, weathered by time, its stone arches unchanging. Visitors walked past it, sometimes unaware of the cries it once held. But for those who knew, the sight of it was unbearable. The stone seemed soaked in memory, a permanent witness to what human beings are capable of in their darkest hours. And so, No Gun Re exists in two worlds. In one, it is a tragedy reluctantly acknowledged, a footnote in the larger narrative of the Korean War. In the other, it is a wound that never closed, carried in the bodies and memories of those who survived, handed down through generations who never saw the bullets but still felt their echo. For the survivors, the massacre was not history, it was life. Every illness, every restless night, every time they walked past the bridge, they relived the days when the sky thundered with gunfire and the world abandoned them. The younger generations of Korea, when they hear of No Gun Re, often react with disbelief. How could Allied forces, the very people meant to protect, unleash such violence on civilians? Yet disbelief turns to reflection, reflection to anger, and anger sometimes to quiet sorrow. In this way, the massacre continues to shape identity, not only for those who endured it but for the descendants who inherit its weight. For the United States, No Gun Re is a ghost in its military archives, a reminder of the moral compromises of war. It complicates the narrative of the Korean War as a forgotten victory, casting a shadow across the heroic stories of survival at Pusan or Incheon. For every tale of bravery, there exists the counterpoint of betrayal. For every soldier who fought to save civilians, there are orders that condemn them. And it is in this contradiction that the uneasy truth of history resides. As the years drift further from 1950, the survivors of No Gun Re grow fewer. Their voices weaken, their eyes dim, and with each passing, a piece of living testimony vanishes. But silence, once broken, cannot be fully restored. What remains is the story itself, preserved in books, in film, in archives, and in the memorial erected near the site. It is a place of quiet remembrance, where names are carved into stone, where offerings are left, where school children visit on field trips to learn that war is not only about battlefields and borders but about the innocent who are crushed in between. And in that memorial, there lies an unspoken lesson, that memory is resistance. To remember No Gun Re is to resist the temptation of easy histories. To recall the massacre is to refuse the comfort of forgetting. The dead cannot return, and justice may never be whole, but memory itself is an act of defiance against erasure. The massacre at No Gun Re teaches us that war is never clean, never neatly divided into good and evil. It is chaos, confusion, fear, and survival, in which lines blur and morality bends. It teaches us that civilians, women, children, the elderly, carry the heaviest burdens of decisions they never made. It teaches us that truth can be buried but not forever silenced. As dusk falls on the bridge, shadows lengthen across the railway tracks. The air carries no sound of gunfire now, only the hum of insects and the rustle of grass. Yet if one listens closely, beyond the present quiet, one can almost hear the echoes, voices calling out, footsteps running, the low, unending rattle of machine guns. It is not imagination but memory embedded in the place. A reminder that the ground remembers, even when people try to forget. And so the epilogue of No Gun Re is not closure. It is an opening, a door into the uncomfortable truth that history is written not only by victors but also by survivors, by those who refuse to let silence win. The massacre remains both a scar and a mirror, showing us the faces of the innocent, the weight of fear, and the fragile, haunting persistence of memory. For in the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of No Gun Re, that even the most carefully buried truths find a way to rise, that even the most silenced cries echo across generations, and that even in the darkest shadows, memory endures. History, when left unfinished, lingers like a half-formed shadow. No Gun Re is one such shadow, suspended between acknowledgement and denial, justice and abandonment, past and present. As the 20th century faded into the 21st, the massacre did not disappear into textbooks alone, it lived on in memories, in arguments, in the restless silence of a bridge that still stood, waiting for people to remember what it had once witnessed. For the survivors, the passing decades did not erase the memory. Instead, the massacre was stitched into their lives, a constant refrain. Some bore scars in their bodies, others in their minds. Every celebration, every funeral, every gathering carried with it the echo of those days under the bridge. They could not look at railway tracks without feeling the vibration of machine guns. They could not hear the roar of planes without remembering the sky darkening with fire. Children of survivors grew up listening to fragmented stories told in whispers, often cut short when tears threatened. The trauma traveled across generations, imprinting itself like an invisible inheritance. But if suffering persisted, so too did resilience. Survivors began to organize, to tell their stories together, to demand acknowledgement not as individuals but as a collective. They sought to turn memory into testimony, testimony into history, and history into responsibility. Their words reached classrooms, newsrooms, and even foreign capitals. The world, which had once turned its back, could no longer remain wholly indifferent. And yet, what did justice look like for No-Gun Re? Could it ever be found? Monetary compensation, when offered, was small, more symbolic than sufficient. Official apologies were carefully worded, shaped by lawyers and diplomats. They acknowledged the deaths but not the deeper crime, the deliberate firing upon civilians. Even when American documents surfaced suggesting soldiers had been told to treat civilians with suspicion, the explanations always bent toward ambiguity. Military officials spoke of confusion, chaos, the fog of war. Survivors, however, remembered clarity. The barrels of machine guns pointed directly at them, the command to fire, the relentless sound of bullets cutting through flesh. This gap between official narrative and lived memory remains one of the most haunting legacies of No-Gun Re. It shows how history is contested ground, shaped by those with the power to write it and those with the courage to resist erasure. For the United States, full admission might have set precedent, might have opened doors to endless claims from other wars. For Korea, full truth risked stirring political divides at a time when unity was fragile. And so both governments chose partial truth, half justice, and uneasy silence. But silence is never absolute. In schools, students read about No-Gun Re not as a footnote but as a pivotal moment of reckoning. Filmmakers turned it into haunting images, ensuring that audiences who might never set foot in Korea could feel the weight of that bridge. Writers and poets took up the massacre as metaphor, a reminder of innocence betrayed. Even in popular culture, whispers of the tragedy found their way into stories about the Korean War, stories no longer entirely celebratory but tinged with shadows. The bridge itself became a site of pilgrimage. Survivors' families gathered there each year, holding ceremonies of remembrance. They lit incense, laid flowers, recited prayers for the dead. Sometimes foreign visitors joined them, scholars, journalists, peace activists, drawn to this quiet place where the veil between past and present seemed thin. Standing beneath the arches, one could feel the chill of history. The stones, once splattered with blood, now bore only moss and lichen, but in the minds of those who knew, they remained stained forever. As the survivors grew older, the urgency to preserve their voices intensified. Oral historians recorded interviews, each trembling word captured for future generations. Some spoke with anger, others with sorrow, still others with a strange calm acceptance. A few survivors expressed forgiveness, not because they had forgotten, but because carrying hatred had become too heavy a burden. Others refused forgiveness altogether, insisting that without full truth and full justice, absolution was impossible. And so, even within the community of survivors, memory diverged. Some wanted peace, others wanted accountability. But all agreed on one thing: the story must never be forgotten. To forget would be to betray the dead. To forget would be to allow the massacre to vanish once again into silence. The haunting legacy of No Gun Re lies not only in the massacre itself but in the questions it raises. Who counts as innocent in war? Who decides when civilians are expendable? How does a nation reconcile its ideals with its actions? And can a bridge, a place of crossing, ever truly carry the weight of so much death? These questions extend beyond Korea. They echo in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in countless places where civilians found themselves crushed between armies. No Gun Re is not an isolated story. It is a mirror of the violence that repeats across history, each time with different uniforms, different languages, but the same cries of the helpless. Perhaps that is why No Gun Re continues to unsettle. It reminds us that atrocities are not accidents of the other side. They are not the sole work of villains, tyrants, or dictators. They can also emerge from those who believe themselves to be liberators, protectors, defenders of freedom. The massacre exposes the fragile boundary between protector and oppressor, between soldier and executioner. It shows how fear and suspicion, when combined with power, can transform ordinary men into agents of horror. And so the story endures not only as a Korean tragedy but as a human one. Each generation that hears it must ask, how do we ensure it does not happen again? What structures, what safeguards, what awareness must be built to prevent the innocent from being sacrificed in the name of expedience? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. As twilight falls over the valley where the bridge still stands, the silence thickens. The railway, once alive with trains, is quieter now, the tracks rusting, the bridge aging. Yet memory lingers in the air. For some, the sight is unbearable to visit, for others, it is sacred ground. Children play nearby, their laughter mingling with the wind. Life goes on, as it must. But beneath the surface, the land remembers. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that history does not vanish when the last witness dies. It lingers in the soil, in the stones, in the atmosphere of a place. It lingers in the stories whispered from parent to child, in the uneasy silence that follows when questions are asked, in the chill that runs through a visitor standing under the bridge at dusk. No Gun Re is a reminder that history is not a straight line but a haunting. It loops, it echoes, it refuses to lie still. The massacre's dead cannot speak, but their silence speaks volumes. Their absence is its own testimony, a permanent emptiness that demands acknowledgement. And so the epilogue closes not with resolution but with reminder. The massacre at No Gun Re will never be fully explained, never be neatly packaged, never be entirely reconciled. It remains an open wound, a scar across the narrative of the Korean War, a question mark in the story of American power, and a quiet lesson carved into the collective memory of humanity. The world may move on. Wars will be fought, treaties signed, generations born and gone. But the bridge will remain. The silence will remain. And somewhere, beneath the arches where civilians once huddled in fear, the echoes will remain, reminding us that the past is never truly past, and that memory, fragile as it is, may be the only form of justice the dead can ever receive.